Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Charlemagne. Charlemagne is a right-wing YouTube creator whose video essays are incredibly detailed and informative and engaging, and I invited him on my channel to talk about the difference between the left and the right, and that is what we do for quite a long period of time. This is my first interview that was using the Starlink technology, which is a bunch of satellites in the sky pinging around internet information. And so Charlemagne does cut out. He's on some mountaintop somewhere homesteading for some reason. We get into that a little bit. He cuts out from time to time, and so there are a little bit more edits than normal in this conversation. Definitely do check out his YouTube channel, links to which are in the description. Without further ado, here is Charlemagne. Speaking of online antics, I've been going through your YouTube, and it doesn't seem like you've uploaded that much the past year.
Not lately, yeah.
Yeah. Did you feel like you said what you needed to say in that space, or just life has moved you to concentrate
A
on
little
other
bit of
things?
both. I mean, especially after the 2020 elections, I kind of felt like there wasn't really much to say anymore. Like, I don't know. I don't like just, especially since I don't like take money for my channel. I don't have any need to just upload for the sake of it.
Yeah.
I have uploaded a few things occasionally, but I feel like politics and the state of things is so like on the nose at this point. Like it's hard to even offer very insightful analysis in the form of a video essay. I mean, some people still do it. I think like Morgoth's review is good at it. Aaron
Yeah.
is good at creating his bite-sized bits. He has really, you can tell he was a former journalist, and
Yeah.
I guess he is one again now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, but yeah, as for me, I don't know. I like explaining interesting ideas, and the video essay format takes a hell of a lot of work,
Yeah.
and things have started moving so fast that it's hard to even find the time to record something that I feel like is worth it. I like blogging more now on my Substack because like I can just write out what are effectively like video scripts and then just get the ideas out and not
Yeah.
have to do all this composition. And people don't even watch videos anymore anyway. They just listen to them.
Yeah.
And people like live streams. So yeah, I don't know. I'm planning on doing a few live streams on my channel if I can manage it with my connection, which I think I can. And talk about Moldbug actually, because I have this friend, Todd Lewis, who's reading on his YouTube channel Praise of Folly. He's reading through the entire Unqualified Reservations blogs and sort of critiquing them with a friend.
Oh, cool.
And I found that really interesting. So I kind of want to invite him and Dave the Distributist on, and my friend Closington on to have a sort of discussion about that, because I do want to do something with my channel. I don't know. I got tired of making video essays because it's just so much work. And to be honest, I was kind of cribbing on Academic Agent for a while because I was sort of co-hosting the cigar streams with him. So
Okay.
I was doing weekly streams, and I was like, okay, I'm doing this, so I don't really need to make content on my own channel. So I don't know. I think things just sort of change. The channel's definitely not retired or anything. Um, Honestly, I just like going on other people's hosted content more because then I just don't have to do anything. Just
You have to worry
show
about
up.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me. I'm kind of in the beginning of trying to figure out what some people call the Dark Enlightenment and other people call Neoreactionary or NRX. I don't know. Like the Neo-right, I don't even know what to call it. But do you have like a favorite word for this kind of this, not cesspool, but this kind of like strange corner where people are being dissidents and critiquing, I guess, basically critiquing the power that is, and then trying to come up with a way to positively create an alternative, which is really, really hard, but it's easy to critique.
Um, could you say that last bit again?
Yeah, well, I don't know the question is like, what do you call where you are, or like the connections that you've made, like this domain? I guess not beginning with Moldbug, but I think Curtis is a inflection point for this. I think that's unarguable. But it's kind of the right. What would you call it?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because I've kind of changed a lot from who I was when I started making my videos about Curtis Yarvin and or Moldbug at the time. I mean, to me, the neo-reactionary right isn't actually right wing, and I think Moldbug himself even says this very directly in his blogs. If you read Unqualified Reservations, he will say outright that he's basically a progressive, and he likes pretty much everything the progressives are for in terms of like an open society. He basically doesn't like how things are run. They're not run efficiently,
Yeah.
especially in terms of like monetary policy. He wants like to maximize economic productivity, basically. And some people would regard that as a sort of right-wing position, like a hyper-capitalist or libertarian position, maybe,
Yeah.
which again he openly admits to being influenced by. But I don't actually view neo-reaction to the extent that that word even means anything
Yeah.
as a legitimate right-wing position. Um, there's
Okay.
this creator you might know who's been around for a long time called Vox Day, and there's something he said once that I found compelling. He said basically anytime you see the word neo in front of something, you could just replace it with not. So like neoconservative, neoliberal,
Huh.
and then I think about neo-reaction. So most people who would actually call themselves reactionaries don't really regard neo-reactionaries as actual reactionaries.
Okay.
In a technical sense, I suppose you could argue that neo-reactionaries, Yarvin in particular, is a reactionary. One of the ways I've come to view Yarvin's brand of neo-reaction, which kind of got hijacked from the Landians in a sense.
Hmm.
Yarvin, in my view, really wants to undo the managerial revolution, which strangely I've heard him argue recently didn't actually happen. Um, yeah, like he said in regards to James Burnham that his worst book is The Managerial Revolution, and that Burnham was basically wrong about the managers taking control, from what I understand,
Okay.
which is a strange position. But regardless of those statements, I view him as his position as wanting to undo that, basically, to wrest control of capital back from the managers to the capitalist class that preceded them, which is interesting because in a very, like I said, technical way, you could describe that as reactionary. I'm not sure if any project like that has ever succeeded before in history,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like literally undoing the previous revolution and sort of rolling things back. But that's what I think he wants. If you read his blogs, I don't even think this is particularly controversial. Like
Mm-hmm.
summation of his ideas is that he literally just wants to reverse what the FDR revolution did to government and turn it back into this system that is organized around not just turn it back, but turn it back and then continue that capitalist process of turning government into this sort of extension of business, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. In
So,
Patchwork, he gets into his theory of government being kind of assumedly corporations with sovereignty over territory. And citizens more or less can elect where they want to live. And so you'd have a world filled with 1,000 or so kind of independent states. And he gets into all the security questions and stuff like that. But it is very CEO startup. That's his thing. Everything's got to be startup.
yeah, one of the issues with that sort of thinking is it ends up being kind of rootless. Like
Hmm.
Moldbug sort of ignores the concept of nationhood in that way in his patchwork system. I mean, it's all well and good to imagine this sort of system of free movement, which is actually a fairly liberal concept, I would think.
Yeah, very
Um,
cosmopolitan. Yeah.
you asked in your message like what is right and what is left
Yeah.
when you were DMing me, and I don't actually think that a right wing really exists to any significant sense in in the Western world at the moment. So the way these things are sort of traditionally viewed is like the right is the sort of the Republican Party or the capitalist side of things, and they're opposed to socialist, and it's all framed in this sort of economic view of the world, which to me has very little to do with what these concepts of right and left actually mean. Which is part of Moldbug's problem, is he sort of also just reduces everything to just economics, really. But to me, that's not what these things are actually about. I would say that what right is politically is the view that people ought to be governed by the systems best suited to their natural state of being, basically. And this, so right is sort of relative to different peoples. So like the way Americans govern and or the way Americans are naturally inclined towards being governed is different than the way a European would, or a Russian or a Japanese person would be governed. You wouldn't a right leaning person wouldn't say that there's this universal system that ought to apply to every people on the planet, which is kind of what we're doing now. And it's actually what the so-called right does in America, where it tries to instantiate this capitalist liberal democracy everywhere in the world. And capitalism to me is just the other side of the coin of socialism. I think these are really both left-wing forms. The issue is capitalism basically appeals to individual self-interests and attacks the spiritual domain and the national domain, and socialism more appeals to like revenge. Socialism is a very easy way to like engage in sort of revenge fantasies against so-called oppressors. I think the problem with both of these is like these terms don't even really make much sense anymore, especially socialism. Like there's no working class anymore, right? Like, what people talk about the working class as if there's like, you know, tens of thousands of people working in these factories in like horrible conditions that are identical to those that were present when Marxist ideas first began to come into being. But if you look at like factory workers now, and I know some, these people make six-figure salaries and they're extremely well paid. I mean, working in a factory is actually like a prestigious job. And you know, the office worker, the sort of proletariat art office worker, I mean, this is also not equivalent at all to what these industrial workers at the time of socialism's heyday were. I mean, at this point, left-wing ideologies that sort of claim to be like socialist or progressive in some way, all they're really doing is helping the neoliberal managerial democracy like perpetuate itself. And the sort of opposition to that is basically just another type of leftist ideology, which we would call capitalism, right?
What makes it leftist? Like what I just need to understand what left is. Is it like
I would say
what's the value set? In one of your essays, you talk about egalitarianism, liberty, fraternity.
left is like ripping apart the natural bonds that bind people together into an organic form that constitutes a national identity, which is what capitalism does. Capitalism, I'll give you an example. So both socialists and capitalists tend to rail against the idea of the peasant. And you can see this if you read literature. You can see this for sure in early Marxist literature. I believe Lenin talked about this, where the peasants are sort of viewed as this reactionary class. And the peasant basically being like landed farmers.
Mm-hmm.
The socialists do not like peasants. They like the worker, the worker who's bound in this industrial system and not the peasant. The problem with the peasant is that he's actually free, regardless of whatever shenanigans are going on in government or in politics. The peasant always has the capabilities to simply ignore it. and support himself. And maybe in certain harder economic times, his crops or animals are he is not subservient to any of these political ideologies.
Okay.
And if you look at say post-war Germany, I'm actually reading a book right now that's sort of addressing like the problem of neo-fascism in Germany in like the early 1950s. And the book makes a similar complaint where it talks about this particular party called the Socialist Reich Party is problematic because it's appealing to the peasants, much like Hitler did. And the idea is basically you should protect the peasants' ability to sell within Germany and not sort of be exposed to the vicissitudes of capitalism from countries, basically. And it sort of mocks them for having this quaint idea that the German peasant shouldn't be in competition, say the Dutch farmers supplying food to Germany at like these better prices because their country isn't as completely ravaged. The problem with this is you rip apart when you sort of you just sort of rip apart the bonds that actually hold people together, and you crush any individual who's actually developed some form of liberty for themselves, right? So now the German peasant, they become subject to the prices of every single other market on the planet and can no longer sustain themselves. And what you've seen happen in Europe, especially, and you can see this happening right now in the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is very much about actually the United States destroying Europe. The European countries are just totally at the mercy of the international system that the United States has put into place. These places can't self-sustain anymore, and when that happens, you destroy what they are as a people, basically. And this is why capitalism ends up being sort of the other side of the coin of socialism, where both are forms that attack the foundations at the base of a society that sort of tie it together into this singular coherent form, whereas socialism uses these internal class divisions and attempts to use it sort of promotes the idea of a slave caste, basically, which is what the worker is, right? So you destroy like the socialists did this, right? Like that's what the kulaks were, is you go and you destroy the people who are genuinely independent of the state and your ideology, and then you bind all of these industrial slaves into a singular class that will overpower everything. And then capitalism is basically doing the same thing in a more insidious way, because it appeals to selfishness, which is like a more universal way to appeal to people. Like not everyone is going to be on board with socialist ideas, especially if you have a lot of money or even if you're middle class. But capitalism can basically appeal to everyone. And that's not to say that like having private property is bad and you shouldn't own possessions or anything. It's just the sort of the untrammeled flow of capital without any concept of protecting people from what can happen when you sort of promote that to its furthest extremes. It ends up being extremely destructive, and everyone begins to view everything in terms of just like the economics of it. Like I was getting some fuel yesterday, and the guy who is filling my propane tanks, he was talking about just making conversation. He's talking about how he's been with this woman for like over a decade, and they haven't gotten married though, even though because it's just a piece of paper, right? And yeah, there's tax benefits to it, so maybe you should do it that way. And to me, it was just bizarre to hear this guy talking about like marriage just in terms of the financial implications of it. So the problem in the West and really the whole world at this point is that there's no right wing that is it's functionally illegal to be right wing, because effectively that's to be a nationalist, right? If you're a nationalist, you're basically subject to all sorts of censorships, and you might lose your job, right? It's totally fine to be a capitalist. You're not gonna like come under censorship because you're like, I'm a capitalist, I love free markets. You might get some like general pushback, I think, but nationalism right now is a very dangerous position for a lot of people to have if you're not really careful with what you mean by that. And just what I mean by nationalism is being for the uh, well-being of groups of people that constitute a nation, as opposed to this idea that like the highest good is the unrestricted flow of money and products. Right, that's basically the highest good right now, and that is not a right-wing position. It's a false opposition to this idea of socialism, which doesn't even exist anyway. Like, is there some Bolshevik revolution happening? I don't know about. Like, capitalism and socialism is just a sort of made-up dialectic at this
Hmm.
point that the ruling class is just using to perpetuate itself by having this false game happening, which is actually Moldbug basically talks about this in Unqualified Reservations, how, and he actually has this new term for it called the show, where it's just this whole fake game of politics happening
Yeah.
between these two sides that only seem to really think about economics. So that's what I mean when the right wing barely even exists anymore. Everyone's a liberal, basically. Even if you're like, I'm against woke, I'm against these left wing crazies. Most people are still liberal at the end of the day. Which is to say,
Meaning they want free association, liberty. Like, what do you mean by liberal? Because different people define that different ways.
I think what you described there is pretty accurate. I like the left wing. I guess you could define liberal in terms of a left liberal and a right liberal. Free association, especially, is more of a right liberal idea. But these right liberals, even they're sort of like, all I want is to be left alone. Basically, just leave me alone. I want to pursue my individual self interests. You know, less taxes the better, less regulations the better, less interferes with me the better. I mean, that's partly why I'm here, why I'm homesteading, right? Is because I agree with this. The problem is that you don't want that as your highest ideal, but like liberals of all types tend to view the sort of unlimited self-expression as the highest ideal. Like, whether or not you're left or right, nobody should be able to tell you, or no force like a government should be able to tell you like what you can or can't do. From the left, this is like, no one can tell you like you can't have your gender be whatever, and that other people must recognize it. Like, that's an infringement of your like freedom, to have people not recognize that. And then a right liberal might be like, you can't force me to do that. That's not good. You can't tell me I have to do this, because you should never, especially they have a problem with the idea of like a moral government. For example, back in my home of Louisiana, this law was just passed where you have to provide an ID, right, in order to access pornography, basically. You have to be 18 years old effectively to access pornography websites is the concept. And obviously that's not really going to work very well, but people will sort of rail against that as like this unacceptable infringement of your rights to do whatever you want in the privacy of your own, home or whatever. From my point of view, this is a good step, if basically ineffective, because pornography is just damaging and deleterious to a society. And it's all well enough that you can say like, look, I can watch it and it's fine, but the problem is when everybody's watching pornography in this unlimited fashion, again, as I've been saying, you rip apart the fabric of society, because you just wreck the relationship between men and women, especially on the male side. But right liberals, people who may potentially regard themselves as right wing, would be against this, because they have this more like libertarian attitude where no state should ever like interfere with your personal life in this way. And to me, that's not what the right is. So in a sense, in my view, we really only have competing left-wing ideologies.
Would
And
a more right-wing form of government be closer to a theocracy then, with moral authority and regulation on humans' behavior, such as like an Islamist government?
that would be something you'd see in like a right Islamist society, possibly. I would say again, the form of government from a right perspective is that which is suited to the people it governs. So a right government in the United States would be some form of republic, federal republic with states where the states had a high degree of autonomy. That's the form that's suited to Americans. And you used an interesting word in there, which is like a moral government, which is something I see mentioned a lot. Like the idea of a government that isn't a moral government doesn't make any sense. Like law absent of morality doesn't make any sense. Like, what does law even mean at that point? All laws are moral laws,
Mhm.
defining what should or should not be done. And in the example I gave, regarding pornography, people get mad at the idea of like morals being enforced on them by the law, but that's all law does. Like, it doesn't do anything else. Doesn't The concept of law sans morals makes literally no sense because what is even defining what the law is at that point? There's always
Mhm.
some sort of law the law is always based on morality in some sense,
Yeah.
whether or not it's Christian, theistic, atheist. It's a moral code that is enforced. So
Yeah.
that it's worth pointing out that this complaint that I see about the law shouldn't like legislate morality. Well, that statement doesn't even make any sense because then you're basically saying there shouldn't be any law at all.
Okay,
Um,
but if you go in that direction, and I agree with you, then the entire concept of the Establishment Clause, the separation of church and state, is ultimately false. Ultimately,
so that's really interesting because the separation of church and state is in the Constitution at a federal level. Back in the early days of the American Republic, there actually were state churches in the individual states. Um, I think that's worth recognizing because we don't necessarily have this sharp restriction between those two entities in America, like people think we do. Um, but this is how Americans like to govern themselves, or
hmm.
once like to. Is it was left to the states to determine, how they wanted to govern themselves. And again, to me, this is what a right person in America believes in terms of how we should be governed. You'll see a lot of ideas on the so-called right. I don't mean to disparage people that like, America should be like a Catholic theocracy or something. I'm a Catholic, right? But America's a Protestant nation. Maybe it could be Catholic one day, but it wouldn't be appropriate to say that America ought to be this Catholic way when it's not. It's fundamentally Protestant. Um, if it is to become Catholic, that should be an organic process that happens over time that is suitable to the people, not forced on them. To try and force it would actually be a left type of thinking because you're trying to force this form upon people that isn't fit to them.
Okay.
Um, so a right government in America like wouldn't be the same as a right government in Europe though, because Europe isn't like federalist, right? And we can't even really say Europe. We'd have to say like individual countries.
Yeah.
Um, take a look at Italy, for example. Like Italy's a pretty weird country because it pretty much always rejects like centralized government. Um, the Italian state is kind of a fiction, really, as it exists now. But you couldn't say the same of like, um, I don't know, France or something. Not in the same way. You could say France, without getting too deep into it. There are like sort of different nations, and France itself is could be called a fiction, but certainly not to the same extent that Italy is, right? So even these individual countries sort of like to govern themselves in a different way. And so like if I were to make the statement that like a right winger should support like an American constitutional system in France or Germany or Italy, like that wouldn't make any sense, right? And likewise, like America doesn't have a king, right? So
Hmm.
monarchism is popular on the right, but that's a form like not really suited to the. That being said, though,
Hmm.
the a form of government is very, very flexible. So the Romans, for example, always viewed themselves as a republic, even when they had emperors, right? Um, the United States still views itself as a republic, just like it's always been, even though it's had many different iterations of that republic. And the republic now is very, very different from the one we originally had. It's actually a lot more monarchical because the Congress has basically delegated all of their authority to executive bureaucracies, basically.
Hmm.
Um, so, which is constitutionally illegal, by the way, but who cares about that anymore? Um, so
So
I think,
a government
yeah,
doesn't force, it enforces or reinforces the people's will or the people's morality or their way of life.
yeah, it's built around their natural way of life,
Okay.
that simply develops as a historical process.
Hmm.
And I think that is the appropriate rightist view of government. Um, the sort of stranglehold ideology has on people now, including the right, um, sort of leads to universalist thinking in everybody. That's why you get these monarchists, who are like basically every single country should be a monarchy, right?
Okay.
Um, or you can pick any other like ideology, Catholic theocracy, right? But I don't think this sort of strict universalist ideological thinking is actually truly rightist thinking.
Well, how does rightist thinking assert itself then if it doesn't somehow universalize itself? Right? How can you have a right
So
world? You can't have a right world
the
because you
concept of a
can't tell
right
the
world,
world to have a right world, right?
well, this is kind of the problem with like you mentioned like Moldbug's patchwork, right? Is like how do you how do you do that, right? Because you need to have this you everyone has to agree to like a treaty to like have open borders with each other basically. But like how are you actually going to enforce that like in perpetuity? Like that's probably going to break down pretty quickly.
Yeah.
The concept of a right world is interesting. I mean, I think right wing ideas and politics can aid each other internationally, but the more appropriate formulation is of a national politics, um, because when you start trying to apply rightist thinking, and you see this a lot lately on the right between Americans and Europeans, you get pretty sharp disagreements, especially with the Ukraine and Russian war that's happening right now. A lot of Europeans are very, very pro-Ukrainian, and a lot of right-wing Americans or not.
Or we are, at this point, a lot of rightists have
you,
been so burnt by the media that they just suspect, or they're not even for or against Ukraine. They're more cautious or wary of the narrative that they're being given. Would that be fair?
yeah, definitely. I would be, I think it would be hard pressed to find like a right winger in the United States who is very pro Ukrainian government at the moment and really just wants to see the Ukrainians like absolutely kick Russia's ass.
Hmm.
But that is a really common view if you talk to Eastern Europeans, especially, people who in very recent history were dominated by the Russians. So these are the problems you inevitably run into if you try to adopt like a global rightist view. Um,
Hmm.
I would just say that rightists should have a supportive attitude toward each other internationally. Um, but the difficulty is that we all have different forms that are suited to us because it's not universalist, and those things might be in competition, and
Hmm.
competition is going to happen, and that's okay because the world isn't perfect, right?
Yeah,
Um,
but what about the people whose life is best suited to being universalists? I mean, what if we've over the years since FDR, however you want to historically think of it, we've just naturally as Americans become bureaucratic. That our bureaucracy is how we want to live. We want to live in these cushy jobs, shuffling papers. That's kind of just our way of life now, and that includes just operating everything by these executive agencies that just redistribute wealth infinitely, and that's just our way of life now.
that's an
Would
interesting counterpoint.
would you go and then have to assess whether it's healthy or not, whether that's a good way
Yes,
of life or not?
yes, there's something. So I think this sort of reaches another. level where you can sort of train people to adopt these forms in a sort of unnatural way. But then they end up in this situation where they're now actually evolved to fit that form. But there's a moral dimension above this too, um, where the way modern society is constituted, there's something incredibly wrong with it. I think pretty much everybody can sense this. There's like a deep sense of malaise in the West at the moment, that sort of comes from the alienation we've all experienced. Um, and this is sort of why you see these sharp political divides as well. I would say that for the rightist who recognizes that there's a better way to live, the only way to actually develop that is not to force it on people, but to sort of be a vanguard for that way of life and demonstrate that there's another way to live that is actually better suited to us. Because although we've been trained to sort of accept these trappings of bureaucracy, I don't think it is actually that well suited to us because people are so incredibly unhappy, and the society is falling apart at the seams, right? You can see this with the problems with marriage and having children, and the economic conditions people are living under because everything is so overly financialized, which turns everyone into this basically like slave caste. Um, I think it's sort of illusory. Like we've evolved as any creature can to cope with this form, but I think under the surface, it's still clear that it's not actually well suited to us, that it would be better for Americans to live in a more traditionally American way. That's more of a pioneering attitude, a brotherly attitude, one built on smaller, less spaces, that look after themselves. This is a more historical American form, I think, and it's one I'm practicing now.
Well, but what do you do with the metropolises? We have several in our country. What do you do with like massive urban centers? I mean, people are living that way. I don't know how you would get them to not live that way. I guess, if San Francisco gets so horrible that everybody leaves and then it's just kind of this jungle, then I guess people will opt out of it. But I don't know what you do with millions of people 300 million people. And then all of the trappings of urban life. Do we go back to farming? Do we, how do we go back to farming at this point? How do we just walk away from technology? Is that what we do? I mean, how do we get back to a more natural way of life with all of the stuff, all the technological advances that, extend and hyperextend ourselves into virtual beings and all of that stuff?
I think definitely not everyone should be a farmer or agrarian or something. I mean, that's one way to do it. But urban life is just as much a part of any people's tradition. Going back thousands of years, it's always been cities. There's definitely a false dichotomy between like urban and rural conflict brewing in a lot of political spheres. And cities are very important, and it's in a properly run city, you actually see the same type of community that you would see in a rural environment. People who sort of adopt this pioneering spirit. I was recently reading this book about George Washington Plunkett. It's called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. Yarvin actually recommended it randomly in some podcast. I write down every book recommendation I hear, and it was interesting to see how New York City was run in the early 20th century, where the cities did actually have real communities in them in a way that's very much falling apart. They're still there today. But part of the problem is cities have largely become like commuter zones. They're not lived in anymore. The people commute from the suburbs, which to me are this sort of hellscape. I used to live in the suburb. You're caught between the rural and the urban with the benefits of neither, because the I found that suburbs, especially as we've gotten into the suburbs of the 21st century, tend to be very deracinating, and they break apart the bonds. Like the bonds don't even form in the first place because the communities now are so heterogeneous and people move around so much and they're so widely dispersed and they have to travel so far to get to anything.
Yeah.
It's like, despite people sort of living in a relatively close proximity, like because none of the social activities that you would normally perform in like a real community are really present in the suburbs. You're sort of just living in this giant glorified apartment complex.
Hmm.
You That's how I felt.
Yeah.
It's like you don't actually get the real bonds where that you would actually get in a city. Like cities themselves, when people actually live in them, can afford to live in them, right? Like you used to have like lower class, middle class people just living in cities, and you still do, but they can less and less afford to do so.
Huh.
I had this bizarre experience a couple of years ago when I went to Manhattan, and I was walking around Manhattan on a weekend, and there was just like nobody there. It was like crazy because you see New York City in like these movies from the 80s, 90s, and it's just hustle and bustle. And then you're there, and it's like a ghost town, and clearly just no one's living there. So this is sort of the problem with the cities today. Is not that they exist, but they likewise just don't have any real communities in them.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. So I
and
guess one aspect of the right is a sense of community that's particular, that's local, that's bounded by tradition, history, intimacy.
yeah, just I would just say the natural relations between people that exist everywhere. I mean, in every place you've ever been in, where people have ever been in the world, they form communities that are connected in flesh and blood. Except in the 21st century, um, where because of this, because of multiple processes going on at once, either
Yeah.
the communist or capitalist ones, um, the communities have basically been ripped apart, and people who are interested in community very much have to sort of consciously rebuild them from the ground up, which is historically kind of crazy that like you would even have to do that. But I
Hmm.
find, myself having to do that. It's like you have to consciously try and create these community bonds with people. And we're also, subject to this weird thing called the internet, which is
Yeah.
simultaneously very helpful and also very harmful in this. But yeah, I think community is at the foundation of any healthy society, whether it's urban, whether it's rural, you get it anywhere. So cities definitely are important cultural centers. It's not something a rightist ought to oppose. It's definitely a mistake to want to sort of de-engineer this like organic structure that forms, right? The
Okay.
city is a natural organic structure that occurs within any civilization, and therefore it's not something that ought to be taken to pieces. This is more of a leftist type of view, which I guess to clarify more what I mean by like left, I see the left as sort of trying to impose these artificial forms onto people, which is what it would be to try and prevent people from forming like urban communities. It's not natural to human beings to do that. Not that everything
So,
natural is good, but
yeah.
cities aren't like unhealthy inherently. Um,
So to I'm trying to get something solid here about the left. So I guess the left is more rationalist, more I guess just thought based. We have a plan, we have a process. We're going to think this is what a human being is. It's more academic, perhaps, in the specific sense of having a bunch of theories that are applied to humanity. So, like in the case of the French Revolution, you have this rational view of man that's then imposed on men for the greater good. So it's more based in theory than in like an empirical kind of just historical rooted. understanding of humans and how to rule them?
I think that's a good formulation. I'm trying to make it more concrete. This is a really difficult question, and I've sort of only even really composed these thoughts since you asked me about it. Like, I would say the idea of utopianism comes to mind. The idea that man can perfect his earthly existence. I think that's very much encapsulated in the ideas you just put forward there, in regard to like what the French Revolution was, or what communism was, or even what free market capitalism is. The idea that we could have this like perfect functioning free market economy that like maximizes everybody's immediate prosperity, which is again kind of what like Yarvin is looking at. I think these all sort of stem from this. I don't want to say theory because there's rightist theory too,
Yeah.
but I feel like I would say a difference between rightist theory is more that it comes after the fact as sort of an explanation of things that are happening, whereas these leftist theories, like in the French Revolution, aren't explaining anything that's real and existing. It's talking about something that ought to exist, and we will make it happen. And then they do, right? And really terrible things happen. So maybe that's one way you could distinguish the two. I mean, obviously, the way I'm defining this is just basically to say that like everything right is good and everything left is bad. Um, which I don't mean to be too polemic there, but I think this the fundamentals here is basically good and evil. Or if you're a Nietzschean, maybe you could just say good and bad. I mean, there are good and bad things, and I'm for
Yervin
the
also
good
used
things.
chaos versus order. Right is order, left is chaos, which is
Yeah,
hard for me to get my head around, but I can kind of see that.
I also kind of see it. I think the one of the issues you get, I mean, a little bit of chaos is good, right? I mean, something that is strictly ordered and has no chaotic elements whatsoever was basically dead. And that's
Or
not what
will
we
be
want.
outcompeted, or the environment will change and it won't be able to change according to the environment. So it will eventually run aground.
Yeah, which is what the United States has done as well, right? Like, and again, thinking back to forms of government, it's not like there's one perpetual form of government that would be appropriate for the United States and at all times and all places. Like, things can change. Like, maybe one day the United States will have an actual emperor like the Romans, and we'll still think of ourselves as a republic, right?
Yeah.
Like that could happen. Um, so
American Caesar.
yeah, maybe we already had one. Some people argue that it was FDR, um,
Yeah.
which wouldn't be great, but
One
that's a more
one
Spenglerian view.
one thing that I found very insightful in Yarvin's work from what's it called, the How Dawkins Got Pwned, where he expresses this idea. I don't know if he expresses it before. I do know he expresses it afterwards too, where he draws I guess he uses the metaphor of the meme or the memeplex, adaptive ideological set of ideas, and he uses that to make an assertion that Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist, his atheism is actually a form of Christianity, and that all of this universalism is kind of a Quakerish form of Christianity. So it did develop. It is a historical, natural, well, I don't know to what degree natural, but it is adaptive. This universalism and a lot of this utopianism and even the gender stuff is very takes some ideas from kind of Christian dogma that have been kind of stripped of the forms of Christianity. A lot of what we're dealing with now, especially in the woke, you have this puritanical movement that is very identical in a lot of ways to foundational American puritanical culture, and it's just the re-exertion of the American spirit in a certain way. So I guess you said that you're a Catholic. Have you always been a Catholic? And I'm wondering how that shapes your view looking at this so-called Protestant nation. Because if we are a Protestant nation, then it would make sense that we'd be constantly protesting all the time for the good of mankind, for these kind of Christian ideas that have been kind of washed of any sort of spirituality.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't really feel like my Catholic persuasion puts me at odds with the Protestants in America in any specific way. I think maybe to me, religion is more of a personal spiritual endeavor.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm a Catholic. I can't escape that. I was born Catholic. My family's been Catholic for since the birth of Christ, basically. So
Oh, wow.
that is what it is, right? I mean, like,
Wow. You
yeah.
can trace your ancestors back to St. Peter?
Well, that's a bit of an assumption. I can trace them back 400 years. I'm assuming that there weren't any, Protestants in the 100 or 200 year gap. Maybe there were a few, but you see what I'm saying is like I'm a Catholic in the same way that I'm an American, and it just is what it is. And there
Okay. Yeah.
there are people who are Protestants because that's what they were. They've been Protestant
Yeah.
since the Reformation, potentially. And
Well, I guess my question is the left a Christian thing? Is it a Christian or even a perversion of Christianity? Can we
it would be
understand
hard
left
to.
by mapping it onto Christianity?
I don't think we can very well. Moldbug makes some interesting arguments in terms of his ultra Calvinism thesis. My buddy Todd Lewis, who I mentioned earlier on the Praise of Folly channel, is actually sort of dealing with this in a very direct way. And I don't recall what religious persuasion he is exactly. It's not Catholic. He's some sort of Protestant, as far as I understand. But he sort of dealt with this question. I'm certainly no expert on it. I mean, back in the day, I was pretty persuaded by Moldbug's ultra Calvinism thesis in regards to like leftism being this sort of like
Pietist?
Christian heresy, and it's interesting. You can see the elements there. Um, I'm not sure how helpful it is in actually understanding the left, though, because I mean, there are Christian remnants within all of us,
Yeah.
whether or not you're a Christian or not, because we come from a Christian civilization. Um,
Yeah.
like I said, going back for at least 1,000 years. So it's like, of course, that element's going to be there, and behavioral patterns fitting that frame are going to be present in almost everything we do. Um, I don't find this particularly helpful
Okay.
in a strict way. I do think I mean, atheism or is definitely a religion or a religious like persuasion, maybe.
Well, don't tell the atheists that. They hate it when you say that.
Yeah, I should also point out here that there's no such thing as an agnostic as well. Like this is just sort of a cope I see some people come up with. Like,
Well, are you saying that
strictly,
people can't be without belief of some sort of fashion, and agnosticism is a cope because they're just not fessing up to the fact that they do believe or have a relationship to the transcendent? What do you mean?
well, agnostic people are usually trying to differentiate themselves from atheists because that's sort of a bad word now.
Oh, okay.
Because people don't really like atheists very much because they tend to view them more as like Richard Dawkins, like actively like anti-God. But strictly speaking, when I say atheist, I just mean you don't believe in God, which is what agnosticism is, or any religion, right? I mean, agnosticism is like you're open to it, but it doesn't really matter if you're open to it. You could be open or closed. You either believe in deity or deities, or you don't, right? I mean, if you want to differentiate yourself from this type of atheist versus that, that's fine. But it's the same thing. So, but anyway, people are almost never separated from sort of religious type of moral thinking. I think the rare man exists who could. The Nietzschean like overman, I suppose, if you want to put it that way, or the master moralist, basically, which a lot of people like to think they are, but
Yeah.
are not, right? Like it's you kind of have to be a psychopath to be that person.
Yeah, or a supercomputer, like where you can just
Yeah,
calculate, utilitarian ethics to the nth degree.
yeah, exactly. Like even people who are atheists, if you talk to them about their morality and be like, wow, it's pretty weird that most of your fundamentals are like basically Christian, and they'll just be like, oh, well, I just rationally decided that it's not right to do this, and I could have chosen any other thing, but it's like, could you really have? I mean, no, you
Huh.
couldn't,
Okay. Yeah.
because you were raised in a Christian society, even if it's not as explicitly Christian as it used to be. I mean, that's just a fact. This sort of gets back to the hyper individualist nature of things. It's like none of us are these sort of isolated individuals. We all belong to a nation. We're all formed in a nation. You cannot escape that.
Okay.
Um, and to sort of pretend like you can um, is only furthers the ripping apart of those structures. Which, to loop back around to what I was saying, this is why I'm against like hyper individualist view, and why I think capitalism, this tendency, is also sort of leftist, because all it does is facilitate alienating yourself from your national and confessional heritage, which you cannot actually do. It's pursuing a course of action that you're actually incapable of completing.
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately harms people. You need to at least recognize like your place in history, basically, which includes a specific national and religious heritage that there's no escaping from, because you were literally raised, steeped in it. And this conceit that you can actually be, Nietzsche's master moralist is something people should avoid having. And a lot of atheists do this, but then act out a politics that has distinctly religious aspects to it,
Yeah.
which we see now in the woke. So Moldbug is definitely onto something. He plays very fast and loose with his historiography. Um, so I both I both disagree and agree with the way he sort of frames progressivism as this like Christian heresy. And I think you talked to Dave the distributist a while back, and I'm pretty sure he would agree with that too. That like Moldbug is correct in a way, but in a very literal sense, he's sort of stretching the analogy a bit.
Okay. Yeah, because if you look at, I'm going to play fast and loose too, with my historiography. But if you look at the way that Christianity spread, it took a religion that was very ethnic, like the Israeli religion, and then it universalized it, and it spread through Europe through the nervous system of the Romans, who had so-called conquered all this territory. But I don't know to what extent the Roman mindset was that we are going to convert everybody into our system of government, and I don't know to what extent Christianity kind of was apolitical in a very deep sense until it became, so powerful that it had to be a political entity, right? But it just as a system of ideas where everybody has a individual soul, that everybody's equal, you see that a lot of the leftist ideas are based on these Christian assumptions. And then when they turn political, that's when they turn either political or too rational and lose something, they start to strip people of their individuality in the sense of their context and their history. So I'm just trying to see if left is just another development of the Christian ethos or an improper implementation of these spiritual ideas into the domain of power. But then if you go to Nietzsche, he would say it's all power, and you're fooling yourself to think that it's not.
Well, Christianity certainly isn't blameless, and there's definitely an aspect of this going on. And this whole universalism thing, and how much is this all of this Christianity's fault is a hot topic right
Well,
now on the internet, right between the Christian and the pagan camp, especially.
have you been watching
Um,
that? I got to get into that because I don't really understand that. Every once in a while, Dave, the distributist's argument with the pagan pops up. I'm like, what's going on over there? It's just like a bunch of guys in loincloths, like working out and drinking raw eggs. I don't get it.
he's a very nice man who really, really wants to extend the olive branch and have a real discussion. But he
Dave,
always
yeah.
finds that it goes nowhere. I mean, the pagans are onto something. The Christians need to take on board uh, the aberrations, heresies, whatever you want to call them, that have stemmed from Christian sects that arguably have resulted in the uh, what we call like the modern day woke left. Right? There's definitely something there, and Christians need to sort of deal with that.
Yeah. Or become
Um,
it, which is, what they're kind of doing. I mean, you see Cthulhu, so-called, always travels in the leftward direction, and that's happening in many denominations, at least in America. Most of Protestantism is becoming increasingly more woke.
as far as like whether or not Christianity is ultimately universalist, this is a weird word to be, and I haven't fully I haven't fully figured out how to address this yet. I mean, we've I don't know what I think about it, I suppose. Like we talked about it earlier, like you were asking me in regard to like what is right, whether or not like this is a universal idea, which I guess it kind of is in a way. I'm not sure that universalism is actually a good word
Okay.
because it seems to put us in these tricky situations where like
Hmm.
no it's like everything is universalist at some level. Like if I'm sitting here saying that like if I'm explaining what rightist ideas are and why everyone should have them, even if they're like relative, like that's a universalist idea. So it's like
Yeah.
Christianity. I mean, Christianity is definitely not universalist in certain aspects. I mean, it certainly doesn't. It doesn't say people are all equal in this world, and it certainly doesn't say that like individual nations shouldn't exist. So the sort of absolute type of universalism you see from the left, pagans will argue that that is like inherent to Christianity.
Okay.
Um, but strictly speaking, it's definitely not preached even in scripture. Um, so yeah, I just sort of I don't like this formulation of
Yeah.
Christianity being universalist. I think it's sort of a rhetorical attack that there's like no way out of, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm trying to
Not
map
that you're
it
doing
out.
that.
Yeah, yeah. I don't mean to attack, but one thing from a right point of view, if you have a doctrine such as Christianity or Islam specifically, let's say that there's only one way toward God. Like this is the way. This is the way. Like Christianity will say that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. There's no one gets to the Father except through Christianity. So a rightist Christian, how do you hold that view of my way is the right way, or Jesus is the right way, and also that across the world, in India somewhere, they have a different way of thinking, and to impose my way of thinking on them is to somehow it's inappropriate for them to be governed according to my morality. It's inappropriate for them to believe and look at the world in the way that I believe and look at the world. Like how can rightness, the right, actually scale in a globalist society where you are connected to other people with other frames of reference and trading with them
Yeah, that's a
specifically?
really tough question. I mean, this is kind of the hardest question you possibly could have asked, and it's one I
Yes.
it's one I think about because I mean, for one, I would just say that you shouldn't impose a religious system on people in a forceful way. In terms of spreading Christianity, it should be preached, and there should be missions,
Hmm.
and it should be brought to other peoples. And if they are to adopt it, it should be done so in a sort of natural fashion. Like you wouldn't, after World War II, for example, we could have like forced Japan to be a Christian nation, right? But that would have been wrong,
Well, we
to
forced
do, in
them
my
to be
view.
a capitalist nation.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's an example I often bring up.
And they did pretty well for themselves, actually.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, their culture is kind of eradicated, though.
Okay.
Like Japanese people are miserable too.
Huh.
Like if you read about like the spiritual health of the average like Japanese person, it's pretty dismal. I actually view what was sometimes I say I forget the exact joke, but I talk about what we did to Japan, right? And people often think I'm referring to the atomic bombs, but I'm actually referring to turning them into a liberal democracy, which you can kind of see the beginnings of Japan trying to reassert its own national identity right now, which I think would ultimately be healthy for them. I mean, if the Japan, if the Japanese want to maintain some of the structures that have been put in place upon them, that's fine. I don't think they should have been forced to be like a capitalist liberal democracy. And they certainly shouldn't have been forced to be Christian, right? It'd be good to have Christian missionaries in Japan, which ironically were nuked by the United States. I don't know if you knew that. The
Uh,
largest
what?
the largest Christian church in Japan was in Hiroshima.
Really?
Um, yeah, it could have been Nagasaki. Pretty sure it was Hiroshima, but yeah, it was blown up. But
Huh.
absent of that, yeah, absolutely, Christian missionaries should go to other countries and spread the faith, basically. But it shouldn't be imposed by like the Pope as like a theocratic emperor upon the world. That's not the way we do things. And also it wouldn't stick. I mean, if you try and force people to be Christian, it's not going to stick. Like
Yeah.
I mean, it could if you go like the Charlemagne route and like murder all of them, right? But I wouldn't say that that's moral either, right? I mean, my avatar literally did that, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, why did you pick Charlemagne then?
oh, yeah, I needed a cool like gamer tag for Xbox,
Oh,
basically.
okay. I
Yeah.
like how a lot of these right thinkers, like their gamer tags ultimately define them at some point. They just stuck with it.
Yeah, it's kind of
Nice.
ironic because when I chose the avatar, it basically had like nothing to do with any of like my particular beliefs or anything, but I've sort of like evolved into it,
Huh.
um, which is pretty funny. But yeah, I would say like again on the religious question, like it's it's not to be forced on people any more than like systems of government are to be forced on people just because it's like the quote unquote correct one. Um, things should be done in a way that respects the national identity of people. Like I wouldn't want to destroy the Indian identity by
Hmm.
turning them Christian. I would like them to be Christian in faith, but the particularisms of Indian culture, um, there's no reason that that should remain. And this is a this is sort of a view like you rarely actually see like anywhere these days from anybody. Like everyone just has these like universal ideologies about how they think the world should be, which is again why I say like I don't find that there are actually many people who think in like in a rightist way anymore because no matter where you look across the board, people have these like universalist takes on like how everything should be governed. And maybe that's just an aspect of the globalized world we live in now.
Yeah. Um, if you look at the way that Catholicism embedded itself in South America, and even in Europe too, this process of kind of assuming the local religions and assuming the gods and then putting Jesus on top of them, just like kind of reordering things. So there is a room for local culture, local customs that is then oriented towards the Christian theology, right? So it's not totally wrecking or what was called colonizing and erasing the local culture. And it seems that that was pretty robust. But I don't really know Catholic history terribly much. But then again, you also made me think that my role as an interviewer is to be nominally left in so far as I can adapt to any given person that I'm speaking to, right? And kind of set aside my morality and my judgment and my opinions in order to attenuate myself to this other person. So in effect, I become kind of a universalist agent by being a chameleon or by being able to be a universal adapter, so to speak, within a certain range, right? And just within the context of a conversation. So I'm effectively kind of free marketplace, kind of liberal in act.
Yeah, I mean, weirdly, maybe unexpectedly, like I'm basically that way as well. Um, you'll see a lot of complaints from certain elements of the right. I mean, there are all these different camps, and sort of the camp that I'm in is actually very open in terms of who we associate with. I mean, one thing I think you'll find among like real rightist people who think like I do, and not people who are just like racist liberals or something, which there are a lot of. Um, like
You don't
you'll
even have to be on the right to be a racist liberal, just to be clear.
yeah, for sure. Um, but I would say a lot of people who, sort of regard themselves as right are basically just like racist liberals. And but in my camp, we're actually like very open, right? I mean, I'm in a extraordinarily diverse group of people, in terms of the ethnic and sexual identities of people I sort of associate with. I mean, I have friends in my internet sphere who are gay, who are transsexual, who are mixed race, who are from this or that country. And this is actually a matter of controversy.
Really?
I don't know if
Yeah.
you're familiar with like millennial woes.
I've
It
heard that name in a while.
Yeah, definitely look him up. He just did this thing called Millennial, which is like a yearly series of like 30 or something interviews over the course of December, which is like an insane undertaking.
Wow.
But he interviewed a pair of people who make content on the internet and do some organized meetups in Great Britain, and one of them's a transsexual, and people on the right in other camps will like throw a lot of vitriol our way, basically saying, we shouldn't like associate with these people because they're like degenerate or whatever.
Yes, yes, yes.
And it's
That is
like,
somehow a right-leaning concept. The degenerate is the same thing as bigot for the left, right? Bigot.
yeah, actually, no, it's that's a good point. It is very much like that. Um, but it's like, look, man, like we're all kind of effed up in modernity. I'm not gonna sit here and you know judge a good person because they have some quote unquote like degenerate tendency. You know,
Yeah.
um, one of my friends goes by John D. He's really into art and stuff, and he associates with this other creator, academic agent, and he's a homosexual. And like, okay, I mean, he's also a Christian, and he's not going to be like, yeah, this is good that I'm a homosexual, right? But it's simply the tragedy of man, right? Is that we all have tendencies that we ought not. Some of us are more obvious about it. Maybe other people have less obvious sins about them, right? But this
Yeah. Okay.
I think this tendency to harshly judge people for something that you personally view as some particularly egregious trespass. I don't think that is appropriate thinking for rightists. Certainly not for Christian rightists.
Okay. So to be right doesn't necessarily that you aren't diverse, inclusive, and equitable somehow. Like, and by equitable, I don't mean. I guess that would be the question. Like, what would equality mean from a right point of view in your mind? Or is
Well,
equality itself just something to do away with? But you treat people equally, so you do have there's a moral value to that. And I bring up diversity, equity, inclusion because those are the ideals right now being
yeah,
preached by the woke, right? So,
I wouldn't say I treat people equally. I think rightists, Christians especially, maybe this is more of a Christian thing. I don't know. It's hard for me to disentangle, but
yeah,
we recognize the equally fallen state of man. I mean,
yeah.
man is fallen. We all have our sins. Um, it's not my business to condemn people for their particularly obvious sins. When I myself certainly have ones that are less obvious. It's obvious if someone's a transsexual, right? And it's sort of easy to attack them for that.
Hmm.
Less obvious are the sins of someone who just like looks like a normal person, but they're certainly there. And again, this just sort of gets back into how a rightist accepts the natural state of
Okay.
things. There's no perfect government. There's no perfect society. There's no perfect human being, and to judge people harshly or to try and force them too strongly because of some very particular imperfection, I I don't think can produce the type of outcome that we ought to be seeking in how we govern ourselves.
Hmm.
Not that we should promote these things or something like that. To sort of try and perfectly form a society, this itself is impossible in the Christian view.
Yeah.
And it's something that rightists fall into the trap of doing too much, I think.
Well, if you're obviously not a performer, but an educator in a way. Your channel is educating people. You write essays, you write blog posts. You're thinking about these things. You're thinking about politics specifically. I don't know if I think it's possible to do that purely academically, where you're just describing things and not hoping for any given particular outcome. But my question is, do you hope for a particular outcome? And what is that? Like, what do you want
Oh,
in the world?
definitely.
Yeah. So what do you want to happen?
I think the outcome that I want right now, in terms of something that's even remotely realistic, is that some sort of vanguard of people maintain the ideals that I've been talking about over the next likely several centuries, because frankly, there's no sort of win here. I mean, for the right in the near term. I mean, what's basically happened is, as I've said, rightist ideas have just been entirely annihilated, and there's a very small segment of people who can sort of maintain them, and that's fine. Civilizations go through extremely trying times, such as you saw in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Poland's a great example, actually. I mean, Poland has been a country that's been probably not existed just as often as it has existed in the last several centuries, and yet
Yeah.
the Polish people endure, right? So, although it sucks, it's not the end of the world if uh, you're on really bad footing and your country doesn't exist. And people who are entirely opposed to your way of thinking are empowered. I mean, sometimes uh, our historical role is just to maintain the little we have for the future.
Okay.
And the situation in the West is basically there's this one dominating ideology, which I would actually, if you really want a definition of like what the left is, I would say it's anti-fascism. I don't mean that like anti-fascism. I mean anti-fascism, one word with the capital A.
Like the
Is
inverse of fascism.
yes, kind
Okay.
of like that. I don't want to be like, the Democrats or the real fascist or whatever, but it is
Okay.
kind of like that, where anti-fascism is sort of this. It's its own independent ideology that isn't just like I'm against fascism. It's more like everything of a certain type that's against the ruling ideology is going to be called fascist. like any sort of nationalism, right, or anything like that.
Yeah. Or
So it's
morality, uh, certain forms of morality.
yeah, exactly. And as long as anti-fascism rules us, which it does with an iron fist, there's no like possibility of having any form of government that's not anti-fascist. I mean, that's what the circumstances are that we're living in.
And
And
by
it's like,
fascists, well, I mean, but you're not advocating for fascism, which would be everything in the state, of the state, and for the state, or
no,
particularly
definitely not.
suited to like Italy wants to be Italy and not just another cog in the globalist machine. It wants to be itself. That's
Yeah,
fascism, or
exactly.
that's what will not be allowed under anti-fascism. And Hungary
Exactly.
too gets criticized for not being a part, not playing ball. Basically, you want to do your own thing, and you don't want to teach queer theory. You freaking fascists! We need to crush you now, or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, that is what anti-fascism is
Okay,
in the long and short of it,
okay,
is it actually has very little to do with opposing fascism, which doesn't exist anymore. Just like the idea you see on the right of like we're against the communists and
yeah.
whatnot. It's like, I mean, that's kind of an outdated way of looking at things. I mean, there's not like some sort of communist revolution happening. I mean, there's what we're in now is definitely like the descendant of communism
Yeah,
after
that's
fascism. But to be like, if I was like, I'm an anti-communist, like that would just be a weird thing to say.
yeah.
Like, um,
But are
this
you
is like
you're
pop.
an anti-globalist though? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that would be fair to say. I like Yarvin's formulation of internationalist. I think his idea of not using slurs and using the ideas people identify themselves with is
Yeah,
good advice. So yeah, I would say I'm anti-internationalist in the sense that there's a international order that should exist and be imposed on all places that overrides any national particularism.
yeah,
I think the national character of peoples around the world is first and foremost what a rightist is looking at preserving. Because frankly, most other things tend to devolve into some form of totalitarianism, um, which seems to be where the West is headed, to be honest. Even if it's quote unquote softer, right? I mean,
yeah.
okay, it's like, yeah, you won't, Stalin's not going to take you out and shoot you for, opposing the ideology, but you certainly might end up, bankrupt in debt and without any job prospects. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
you know,
Without any of your social credit to buy gas to get a job, right? Because you spent all your global dollars or your climate bucks that month.
yeah, exactly. Which is happening, by
Yeah,
the way. I mean, like people will mock this, but it's like the governments of the world are openly talking about digital currencies and are actively like beginning to develop them that are going to do exactly this. So,
yeah. I don't think Canada's an aberration. I think it somehow got ahead of the pack somehow in a lot of different respects.
hmm
And maybe it did things too quickly, where people weren't ready with the trucker protest, is specifically how they were cut off from their monetary and punished financially for that. While at the same time, that leader Trudeau is praising other uprisings across the globe that end up going in his direction. Right? He's all for protest when it's going in the globalist direction, but not when it goes against his direction.
that's interesting that you mentioned the truckers because that's the truckers are sort of an example of that hated reactionary peasant class
Yes,
that both capitalists and socialists seem to
kulaks.
despise. Yeah, because their truck is like their independent, self-sustaining property,
Yeah,
right? And you'll always see um, socialists attack this because it undermines working class solidarity. That there's these people who can sort of operate outside of it, outside of it with like a genuine form of liberty. And capitalists likewise will attack this um because they're viewed as like proto-fascist basically, right? That's sort of the rhetoric you see coming from the state. And the state is primarily more capitalist than socialist. It has like these woke aspects to it, right? But the way
Yeah.
the state runs itself is primarily as like a capitalist system,
What do you mean?
or people say like neoliberal, right? Like if
Okay.
you actually look at the way the US government operates and what its interests are, I mean, they're basically all financial. And uh like the United States has very little interest in actually spreading woke ideology. It's mostly interested in controlling global resources and for the ruling elite to create as much money and wealth as possible for themselves, right?
Yeah.
And the woke stuff is sort of this like acid it applies um as sort of like a foot soldier element to deal with quote unquote fascists, right?
Or
Like the
diversity, true
truckers.
diversity. It's really interesting.
Hmm.
It's that pride flag is just such a concretization of what does Aaron call it? Like the state religion or the empire's religion. Just the way that it's mutating and becoming more and more incoherent, and then yet being marched up hills by soldiers, being flown by the State Department, right? The state. I have a picture of the State Department taking down the American flag and putting up the progressive pride flag. It's so obvious what that represents, which is it looks like diversity, but what it does is go through and erodes any sort of particularity. It goes through and it basically erodes identity by enforcing a relationship of identity that's completely foreign to any sort of natural identity. It's all pseudo identity.
Yeah, that stuff is just bizarre. Like I don't at this point I legitimately cannot comprehend the mind of like a person who is like
Huh.
pro pride flag basically, but then also sees the pride flag being like put up by the State Department and at its embassies. Like how do you even square that? I mean, I went through college, right? And I went through the whole like progressive or default liberal like way of thinking. And there was like a time when I could understand it, right? In the early like Trump era. But we've gotten to a point now where it's like I can't even comprehend like how do you like rationalize this in your head? Where like it's so obvious at this
Huh.
point that the red flag is the symbol of power, the
Yeah.
power of a state. And it's
Yeah.
it's not rebellious or anything. And I mean it's the ruling ideology in like every conceivable way. Like anti-fascism has complete dominance, full spectrum dominance over politics. So yeah, I can't. It's a strange feeling because I just cannot empathize with the pro regime side anymore because it's so
Huh.
obscene in its actions. Like I can't figure out how a human being can rationalize like this view of being like this political progressive sort of fight the power type person when like every single aspect of power is on their side.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, you see that a lot in the 2020 was just so fascinating. The Black Lives Matter protests in Seattle, which I'm near. Everybody went out of the street and walked around with their masks on, and then they allowed a part of the city to become autonomous somehow, and so to protect the black people, they got their own square blocks and they were going to grow some corn in a garden or something. And then it ends up that they started their own police force and ended up killing young black men by the end of it. But all those well-meaning liberals pouring all that money into Black Lives Matter, and representing that and putting, George Floyd pictures, on their profile and stuff. And not really caring about where the money goes or any substantive change, and not really caring to look into the history of things other than this very particular interpretation of history of black people being subjugated constantly and up to this day to massive amounts of state enforced violence, and just buying into that narrative and then not really seeing it's an act of faith, really. It's a performative thing, and no, I think it's actually very meaningfully performative. It's just, I guess I see what you're saying, where there's a disconnect in the feeling of doing and being good and the reality of doing what power requires of you, and signaling that you are obedient to power. Because power is dressed up somehow like a drag queen that you have to see as good, even though it's like it's a man in a dress, but you have to think of it as like, the Statue of Liberty, right? Like, what I mean to say is that power is power. It's a pig, and you put lipstick on the pig, like with this pride flag, and all of a sudden, like, it's no longer a pig. It's like, yeah. So I guess I see the disconnect there, but I can also kind of see that a lack of critical thinking, or just being trusting the government, just trusting the narrative, trusting the story, allows people to get that far along with it.
Yeah, well, people want to feel like they're the good guy, like they're doing the right thing. And if there's this very, very easy, non-controversial vector that lets you feel like you're doing good, I mean, people are going to take it. It's just like, again, it's sort of the flip side of the coin. It's like you can be on the left and just sort of collaborate with power, or you could be on the right and be like this hyper individualist and I'm a rebel and I'm gonna do it my own way. But really, that ends up being just as deleterious as the left in a not straightforward way, because the sort of the lack of understanding of the importance of a strong group, over the individual, undermines the right. And unfortunately, the so-called right is more focused on individualism and capitalism and the economic aspects than anything. And it just, it traps the majority of people, very, very good people. If you talk to like the average Republican, they're good persons, but they're focused on this just boomer mindset of like everything is just about, personal freedom, and my own liberty, and freedom from anyone telling me what to do. And that ultimately that's not sustainable, because then other
at the
people,
same time, you don't want to tell people what to do, though, right?
yeah, I don't, for sure.
But
That's the weird thing is,
there's a
someone has to
contradiction.
tell us what to do. I mean, I don't want to tell people what to do. That's a thing people often get into when you're arguing with them about like what is the right policy. It's like people misunderstand a lot of right wingers where they think like you want to like personally enforce your own morality, which that's not the point. It's more like there needs to be that is what the law does, is it enforces some sort of moral framework that holds the society together. And like that's all rightists really advocate for. But people see everything so personally now that they can't really conceptualize this. They always view any sort of like moral code in the law, some obvious or like a Christian moral code, as some sort of like deep trespass, right? That like you just can't do that. It's evil somehow to tell people what to do.
That impulse is good insofar as it keeps something such as wokeness at bay. Even though wokeness will completely encroach throughout the legal system, it might be the case that it can be stopped because there's a deep-rooted impulse to not have explicit morality embedded in law, but rather an implicit morality. But if you see, the really interesting thing about one aspect of the gender issue is that the law never defined what a woman was. It never got around to defining it. It was just assumed what a woman was, right? And granted rights to women over the course and modified the status of women. But it was never really conceived in law. And so gender theory comes along and imposes this idea that a woman isn't a natural category. It's a social construct, so-called. And the law just kind of has to go along with it because nobody argued. So there has to be work in law to define these terms that have been brought under question by this incredibly radical form of, denormalizing everything or anti-normalizing everything. So I forgot the point of that, but.
Well, this is why sort of maintaining these historical bonds between people is so important, because you can't actually legislate everything like that, which is sort of like a problem we have in like Anglo law in particular, really more the American side, is like trying to meticulously write down every single possible aspect of the law, but there's always just holes in it. You can't rely on
Yeah.
the law to maintain your society.
Yeah.
It has to be done at the social level. And
Yeah.
because all of that was eroded um, by like particularly the post-war capitalist America,
Huh.
like just left the doors wide open for the and find all these little holes in the law and abuse them because that's not what the law is supposed to do.
Hmm.
There's some I forget the Latin for it, but there's a Roman saying that the law doesn't concern itself with trivialities, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's for the trivialities aren't a problem if you have
Common sense.
yes.
And
Um,
we lack common sense. You know, people say, where did common sense go? And you're like, well, it's
well, it's
gone.
because we
Like,
lack the common. There's no common.
yeah,
You
that's
can't
a
have
good one.
you can't
Yeah.
have sense. There's not a common.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's
Do you
like
see
really
what's
like
happening? Oh, sorry, go on.
just walk around a city and just like recognize how much it's not lived in. Like there's just not there's businesses there, but there's not people living there.
Yeah.
It's like everybody's a tourist, even in your home city, because most people can't afford to live there. Um,
Yeah.
and if you do, you're sort of in this isolated class. Almost everybody's a tourist in a city these days. Like,
Yeah.
back in Louisiana, I used to work in the city, but I would have to commute there from the suburbs. So, to me, it was just as foreign as somewhere, 1,000 miles away, basically, in terms of like knowing the people there, right?
Yeah.
Because I had no real bonds with them.
Did
Anyway.
And you would go to church, and I guess school would be places where you made bonds with people.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, uh, yeah, I think I'm more into homeschooling now as a idea. But
Yeah. Well,
that's for
you're on a mountain, so I guess you just homeschool yourself all the time then.
pretty much. I'm reading a lot. Um, People are afraid of homeschooling, but I don't know. To me, it seems pretty straightforward. Like
Well,
I don't.
who's afraid of homeschool?
A lot
I
of
know the
people
regime
think
is.
it's going to produce like. A lot of people seem to think it's going to produce like antisocial people who are like incapable of like as if like you put your children in like a box and you never let them see anybody and
Yeah,
like
right.
government schooling's the only possible way to socialize, but
Yeah.
it kind of is though in a way when the community breaks down, right? And
Yes.
it's hard to find community functions now anywhere.
Yeah.
So they're sort of on to something, but only that you have to more proactively if you're going to like homeschool your children, just as in anything, you have to like more proactively seek out community. It's not just like there for you anymore. And because most people just sort of like go with the natural flow of things rather than really actively thinking about this stuff like internet autists do, they're just going to get into that trap of I have no community, right?
Yeah.
Just like the other day, not the other day, a couple of weeks ago when I went into the city, I went to my local game store or whatever, and there were some people in there playing Warhammer 40K. Um, but like it was so they were like it was so small, and how do I put this? Like the game store isn't what it used to be. Like even in this area of life, because people are so far apart and so disconnected from each other,
Yeah.
even things like these nerd hobbies have to be sort of artificially like reconstructed because like you can't just form a natural group anymore because you're not associating with people as much. Like in order to find the game store, you got to like go on the internet and Google the game store, and go there and meet people because like you just don't know people in your life anymore. Like
Huh.
in order to know people, you have to like very actively seek them out and try to make the connections, because like people just don't interface with each other anymore, like they used to.
Well, like they used to, but this is the question. You're at once a hermit and the opposite of a hermit insofar as you utilize the internet to participate in community. Right. Like you are known and you know others and you produce content. Like that's what you guys do. Instead of gaming, you make videos, right? Or you talk about ideas with people. Is that not the same thing? How is it substantially different to be an online citizen as opposed to, somebody who's connected with people in real life? Like, what is there really that much difference?
There's a big difference in that your internet community, um, it's very fragile, because you can't actually help each other in any material way.
Well, there's
You can
GoFundMe.
talk, sure, but I need a guy to hold up,
Oh,
you
okay.
know, a
Yeah.
piece of wood to build my door, and it's like,
Yeah.
well, all the British people I know aren't gonna like. I could ask them for money, but I mean,
Yeah.
so you see, like the internet's weird. Like this stuff is good, I think. The internet provides a lot of opportunities to meet people and form these groups, and there's definitely nothing inherently wrong with them, but they can't substitute for
Hmm.
the the way people used to associate with each other because it's not like this is just some like trad thing, right? It's like you need to know people in
Huh.
your life so you can support each other. I mean, this
Yeah.
is the way you do charity, right? I tell people don't donate to charities. Like, just perform charitable deeds for your friends. Help your friends out, the people you actually know or your neighbors,
Yeah.
right? Don't do this like telescopic empathy thing that really captures, as we were talking about the left or the people who support like power, basically.
Yeah.
It gives you this opportunity for like telescopic
Caring.
charity or
Yeah.
empathy, and it's like
Yeah.
that doesn't actually, it's not real.
Well,
It's
it's not real, and then it turns out to be a big scam in the case of FTX or whatever, right? Or effective
Yeah.
altruism. I'm gonna take this dollar and give it away in the most powerful way imaginable by donating it all to the Democratic Party, I guess, right?
Yeah, I've actually on Millennial this year. There was a guy called Horace. He goes by Horace online. He did an interview with Millennial Woes talking about FTX, and it was the only deep dive I had looked into it. But his conclusion was basically it seems that Sam Bankman-Fried may have actually been genuine in his effective altruism, but was so sort of diluted in terms of how power works that
Huh.
like he just went on these crazy financials. Or like imagine just putting a millennial in charge of billions of dollars
Yeah,
and just watch what happens, right? Not that there wasn't
billions.
tons of corruption, but I think the possibility that he was actually sincere in some capacity and just
Yeah,
should be taken on board.
yeah.
And it actually
Dave,
seems kind of likely.
Dave said Dave did a one of his 5 hour live streams. But there's like this 15-minute insight into that character, that Sam Bankman Fried guy, where he just has no concept of taste. He has no concept of value. He's just this trust fund kid. He drives around in a Corolla because he has no sense of taste, what money is for. He doesn't really understand what he's doing. He doesn't really have any connection to, value or significance. But he could be completely sincere because that's what he was given. This is what he's been born and brought up in. So Dave was pretty compassionate, and scathingly so, without calling the guy evil.
Yeah, as he does.
Yeah, as he does.
Uh,
So you mentioned that the job is to carry forward these ideals into the future, even though but there's no possibility for your ideals to be enacted on a political level or even just on at scale at this point in time. So what kind of are those ideals then? Just to try to summarize, like, what are your ideals? What is the most important thing for people to carry forward in your estimation?
I think primarily your faith, um, imbuing your progeny with the values that I've been talking about that aren't common. I mean,
Hmm.
I guess you could say God, king, and country, I suppose. Although in the American way, we would leave out the king part. Perhaps you could say God, family, nation would be a better formulation of. I mean, my ideals are basically just that people form good Christian families and live in the best way they possibly can, despite all of the deleterious elements of modernity attacking us constantly.
Hmm.
That's my ideal, is that people are able to do this. In the long term, what I would hope that that would actually evolve into is a situation in the United States um, where we've somehow overcome the alienation that technology weirdly brings
Huh.
and have what you would call real communities and a genuine liberty for people to live in the ways appropriate to them, absent this imperial authority from Washington D.C. sort of imposing on people.
And what's going to happen to DC? You think it'll ever stop? Or it's just like fragment?
And composite. And I would like to see Europeans freed from the yoke of America as well, and for each of their countries to continue to exist and contribute their unique aspects to our global civilization, which certainly can't be undone. I'm, I think people shouldn't be erased, basically, and that's what we're seeing now. Unfortunately, is this there's an attempt to just erase the the uniqueness of all the nations across the world, and unfortunately, it's mostly being perpetuated by the United States.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I just think it's wrong to try and destroy people's culture, and I would like to see culture genuinely flourish without it being illegal.
You just want to fly a swastika. That's just what you want to do on your mountain.
Definitely not in the U.S.
No.
There's no. That's a common conceit of the right. But fascism doesn't make any sense in the United States. I mean, it's not American. I would
Yeah,
like to fly my state flag. Is what I would like. At the
Yeah.
last city council meeting I went to, we did the Pledge of Allegiance, and I was just disgusted to pledge allegiance to that flag. To be honest, I don't. That the American flag.
Really?
Why am I allegiant? Yeah, I mean,
Huh.
that it's because it's crushing me, right?
Huh.
That's what the government does. I would rather pledge allegiance to my state flag. That's my ideal.
Because your state
Not that
crushes you softer.
well, my state. I mean, right now, there's sort of this struggle in some states between the federal government and the state government, and what the state really represents is what I've been talking about: is this ability for people to govern themselves in a way appropriate to them. And right now, the federal government is attempting to homogenize us. It was a weird feeling because I hadn't said the Pledge of Allegiance in probably, I don't know, over a decade at least, and I felt myself just kind of grossed out by, I don't know, 50 or so people pledging allegiance to this flag that was actively harming them. Because like at the meeting, there were particular federal aspects that were affecting our town that were under discussion, and it's like, why are we pledging allegiance to this thing? Not that I'm like,
Yeah.
not that I'm like against America or something, but it's weird because the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag is kind of a contrivance as well. I mean, it was created, I think, sometime in the mid 1900s. I mean, if you look at the oaths that military enlisted and officers take, it's to the Constitution, right? Not this flag, not this imperial symbol, basically,
Yeah.
which is what it amounts to. Again, not that I'm not like patriotic or anything, but Americans sort of need to get over this idea of America as this imperial force that goes throughout the world, making everything, good and democratic and liberal. Like, unfortunately, that's what a lot of Americans are for, basically, like Republican voters in particular, people who would think of themselves as right, or are actually like very much pro-American empire, basically. Like they'll celebrate like the destruction of the Japanese or the destruction of Russia or something in the current war, and it's like, why are you like, why do you hate the Russians so much? I don't I don't get it. Why should you want to see these other people like annihilated? Why should you try and bring down their state, basically,
Yeah,
which is
well,
what a lot of Americans want, right?
it's difficult. There is a association between patriotism and chauvinism, right? It's a hard line to walk where you're proud of your country and you're not like warrior like, I guess, or like how do you channel that warrior like that sportsman, like kind of that geopolitical sports team kind of rah 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 feeling. You have to capitalize and contain that energy, that natural outgrowth of patriotism, which I think that's probably why, in your terminology, the anti-fascists are the way they are with regard to the right, with regard to guns, with regard to truckers, people who are independent, because they don't want those people forming together into a patriot front and then taking over a city or whatever. Patriot Front's never going to do anything, but it's
Right,
the
exactly.
living embodiment. I think it's a Fed thing, but it's the living embodiment of so many, I guess, liberal journos, like this, all these white guys in these white t-shirts and bandanas, like they're going to take over the world when they're just so pathetic. Like, why do we even care about those people? But that's the image that either they're playing into that image being scary, but I also think that any sort of nationalism comes with the baggage of war, right? And what do we do with that kind of warrior energy? And how does that not, how do you have Colorado not declare war on Arkansas for some reason without some sort of like overarching structure, some sort of federalism?
Oh yeah, I mean there definitely should be an American government that is a federal government over all the states. I'm certainly not against that. I'm certainly like I support the Constitution, right? I think our Constitution is a fine document, and we would live in a much better nation if we actually adhered to it, and not the modern perversions of. I mean, the
Yeah.
Constitution doesn't exist anymore, right?
No.
It literally is just a piece of paper. Um, but I think it is an ideal that Americans ought to try and live up to. It is our heritage, and it is the way that we wanted to govern ourselves, basically. And that's why I'm so I find like the current federal government is just appalling because it's an imperial government. It's not a national government. That's the problem. And for rightists, we're in this weird position often where we're sort of stuck in this limbo of wanting our country to do well, but also recognizing that our country is one of the most evil forces on the planet at the moment. But not the country, right? Like the federal government, which is
Yeah.
distinct from America.
Yeah.
It's a problem, but one I don't know. We just have to rationalize in our heads somehow.
Well,
It's like
it's,
I want America to do well, but I
yeah.
don't want America to rule the world because it's trashing the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's all in the Bible, powers and principalities, the whore of Babylon, Cthulhu or whatever, right? The great serpent, the great dragon. I mean, you're writing, it's just this thing, this naturally occurring entity that keeps on popping up. And if it wasn't America, it'd be someone else, unless America was strong enough and restrained enough to keep other people's hands off of it and to keep its hands off of other people. And that was one kind of cool thing that Trump capitalized on, that kind of isolationist energy. Actually, I think Trump probably did pretty good geopolitically with a lot of different things. I mean, he brought peace to the Middle East somehow for a brief period of time, but maybe that was just untenable. But
Well, I think that's why he was removed from office. I mean, it's sort of difficult to imagine the current war in Ukraine happening with a Trump in office. I mean, also Biden would be removed from office if he didn't prosecute that war, right? I mean, because the reason that war is happening is to destroy Russia and, more importantly, keep the United States or keep Europe under the yoke of the United States. That's really what the war is about. Is sort of this dual purpose where it's like a cheap way to attack Russia, but also bind Europe strongly into NATO, which is just an extension of the United States military.
And you think that most Europeans are on board with being a part of NATO or being basically
weirdly,
an
yes,
extension of the US?
Yes. This is a problem that a lot of people on the European right don't seem to fully comprehend. As I said earlier, a lot of Eastern Europeans, especially, are very pro-NATO because
they're anti-Russia, yeah,
for obvious reasons. But that's kind of silly because, I mean, the idea that Russia is going to like invade Poland or something is insane. I mean, Russia's devastated. It spent the last 30 years being economically devastated. Like, if I were an Eastern European nationalist, to me, especially with the war going, it would be the perfect time to leave NATO. Like, why? Like, Russia is totally bogged down in Ukraine. What does any other country in Europe have to fear from Russia right now? Now's a golden opportunity to say, you know what? We're going to get out of this alliance that no longer is fit for purpose because the Cold War's are over, and we're going to form our own defensive alliance. You know, France has nuclear weapons. Poland has an enormous army. Why do they need to be in NATO? You know, NATO attaches Europe to America irrevocably, and the European Union.
Isn't that what these like climate accords do on another level too?
Yeah, because the U.S. can deal with it. The U.S. can deal with it, right? Like because the U.S. is super wealthy. But when you rope all these other less wealthy powers into these climate accords that the UN, which is an extension of the U.S., backs, you just make them poor, right? That's how the United States operates. Is it keeps Europe in a state of perpetual economic servitude to the United States by preventing it from actually acting as a coherent economic bloc. It's always dependent on the U.S., like I said, with NATO for defense, and then for anything else and all these other aspects. Like the euro is basically an extension of the dollar.
Yarvin would go so far as to say the New York Times is, sets the trend for every other news source, and you see that like Britain or a lot of Britain news kind of catches up to where the New York Times is. They're kind of cathedraling in the same.
Well, and they go even further. Like weirdly, the vassal states of the U.S., and I think Yarvin even makes this point. Like you mentioned, Canada did this earlier. Like they go above and beyond to be like American, even more than America does itself. I think he wrote that all the way back in like 2007 or something. How the Europeans like are trying to hold up the true American ideal that like America is failing to do.
Liberty and justice for all, or socialized medicine for all? What do you mean?
Yeah, both, I suppose. That's another huge problem is socialized medicine. If you look into like the military budget of the Soviet Union, I think they were spending was it like 60% of their budget on the military. The U.S. only spends like 10% of our 12% actually of our budget on the military. But we spend 2/3 of our budget on Medicare, Medicaid, and various welfare programs.
Yeah,
which is insane. I mean, that's a huge weakness the American empire has. Is this Achilles heel that ultimately we know Social Security is insolvent, right? And we're becoming a more unhealthy society, and we're spending all this capital on desperately trying to keep. I mean, in some places we're making people even more unhealthy. But I wanted to go back to the European economics thing. One interesting thing you'll see in the U.S. too is that I think people don't fully comprehend is like Biden is sort of maligned for sort of tapping into our strategic oil reserves and shutting down fracking and all of this.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about oil is that the US has way more of it than uh well, the US has an insane amount of oil
Yeah.
that is untapped, that we can tap into whenever we need to. So, why tap into that oil right now? Geostrategically, it would be a good position for the US to be in for the oil to run out everywhere else in the world and for us to be sitting, high and mighty on all this oil we have.
Yeah.
Um, which also is kind of what the Ukraine war is about, by the way. I mean, Russia's looking for access to oil reserves in the Black Sea, that it can have sovereignty over
Yeah.
under international law, right? If it controls the territory near it. So it's important to keep that in mind too. And that's why the Europe is being converted to green energy, right? It's because green energy doesn't work. It can supplement your
Yeah.
energy requirements, but it doesn't work. It'll make your country poor. And Europe is very much going whole hog to green energy, which is what the United States wants because it prevents Europe from becoming energy independent from the US. Because the US can keep it dependent on the United States' massive supply of oil for the next like 100 years, right? Um,
So you think all
so
this green energy push in the United States is kind of a false flag? It won't be implemented?
I
Carbon
think the
taxes
green
and
that
stuff?
I think the green energy stuff. I think our elite are quote unquote collapse pilled. They understand that um, is society is degrading, um, like just in terms of raw people, and we're also running out of resources. Humans are multiplying at an incredible rate. There's simply not enough fossil fuel left in the world to power the industrialized societies if they continue to accelerate like this. So the only way to get energy, um, or the only way to deal with that, is to find alternative sources of energy, uh, which green energy is, but it can only buffer it. Um, get more oil, or use less oil. The only real way to get more oil at this point is to go to war with other countries. And the way to use less is to reduce your population. And I think that's why we see these sort of population reduction policies basically going on in the West. Like a lot of people sort of think the elite are these like evil mustache twirling people. I think in their own way they have to rationalize what they're doing is good.
Yeah.
And I think they understand that the population needs to go down and we need to save our oil reserves for when this peak oil situation happens, basically. And we need this green energy to buttress us. And if the United States is the best off when this collapse sets in from fossil fuels running out, uh, that's a position we want to be in. So I think behind all the corruption that is certainly going on and all the evil that is certainly going on, there are real geopolitical interests at work, in this war, and the economic policies around green energy and energy policy in general that the UN promotes. But yeah, we can keep going on this if you want, but I feel like we're kind of going into tangent territory now.
Tangent territory.
But
Um,
I've been studying this stuff recently with a couple of other friends.
yeah.
So it's sort of a point of interest
Yeah.
at the moment.
What,
Because I think
where do you think you're going with this studying? What kind of ideas are you forming, or
just figuring
territory
out
are you
what the
making?
hell is going on in Europe, like what is this
Okay.
war about?
Yeah.
What is Russia doing? What is Europe doing? What is the United States doing? It really all does come back to energy. Um, there's been a lot of memes about peak oil from, you know, the left, but this is a real thing, right? There's a limited supply, as far as we can tell, of fossil fuels, and eventually it's going to run out. And it's the only viable source of energy, right?
Well,
Because I'm
barring
because I'm
nuclear, you don't think nuclear is viable? If we all go
it
battery,
is
yeah.
to some extent. It's There's not enough uranium in the world to actually replace fossil fuels with nuclear. So nuclear just falls into this green energy category where it sort of buttresses the collapsing availability of oil. Um, that's coming, right? This is going to happen probably sometime this century. So yeah, people often say like, "Oh, can't we just all go nuclear?" We actually can't because there's just not enough fuel because our energy requirements are going upwards at such an insane rate. Right? It's not just the current energy demands; it's the demands of the future. And make no mistake, all of these countries' foreign policy, particularly the United States, is based primarily on these future energy needs.
Yeah.
And the war in Ukraine has very little to do with concerns about Ukraine's sovereignty or anything like that. It has everything to do with ensuring that the United States has no competitors because Europe stays poor and Russia potentially fragments into a million pieces, which I think is unlikely, but I think that's what the State Department wants in the United States.
Interesting. Where do you foresee do you foresee, how long do you foresee the Ukraine thing going on? Do you have any sense of that? Some people say years and years. Some people, I mean, it's been a year now.
Well, it's been almost a year. I'd say I've probably only made bad predictions on it so far.
Okay. Yeah, that's
But
fair.
I think it's going to go on for years. I think people in the West don't understand Russia. They don't understand the Russian way of war. Um, Russia is just not going to give up in that war, and the country's not going to fall apart either. They're going to stay there and grind out. I mean, the war in Ukraine is basically two Russian armies fighting each other uh, in terms of like what the military background of this part of the world is, and they are just going to grind it out for years and years for as long as it takes, and they're never going to back down. So I sort of see it as a sort of frozen conflict that's going to go on for indefinitely, like the wars in Syria, etc., until possibly the United States backs down.
Yeah.
I think the point the point will come when, 'cause what's happening right now is the Ukrainian war is a genius strategy from the United States perspective because the United States has decades and decades of military buildup of weapons that are designed specifically to fight Russian Cold War tanks. And all that stuff's going to expire and we're just going to destroy it. So instead, we send it to Ukraine. And now there's basically the hot war that could have happened in the Cold War is literally happening right now in Ukraine between US designed technology specifically designed to fight Russia. So it's extremely cheap in terms of, I don't support the war, but in terms of geopolitical strategy, you basically couldn't get a better deal because we already have all the stuff, but we're going to run out of that stuff.
Yeah.
The question is the US going to ramp up its military production to basically a war footing of modern technology? And is Ukraine going to switch over to current NATO tech to continue the war? This is all up to what the US decides to do and what it can do. And because of the way the US political system works, it can be a bit schizophrenic. So maybe we'll find out in the next presidential election or two how this is going to go. I don't know, but I think the war can basically go on indefinitely.
Unless the U.S. and
within
NATO
reason.
back out.
Pretty much, yeah, because Russia cannot back out. I mean, I'm not sure how much you're familiar with like the geography mainly of this part of the world, but the way Europe is set up is Ukraine is this enormous plain that is basically perfect for assaulting enormous armies across, which we've seen before in the 20th century. Ukraine joining NATO puts Russia in an impossible geopolitical situation where it basically condemns Russia to losing any hope it has of being anything more than just another country, which obviously Russia's not going to stand for that, right? People will be like, "Oh, Russia should just give up because
Yeah. Why not?
they're going to lose." But like, why would you do that, right? Like that never works. It didn't work during World War II, right? When we told the Axis powers, "You're going to unconditionally surrender to us, and you're going to lose." But history shows that countries just fight it out anyway. It's not countries don't just look at the odds on paper and then be like, "Oh, the odds are really bad. I guess we'll just give up," right? That's basically what a lot of people in the West expect Russia to do. But from the Russian perspective, it's an impossible situation. And that's why they're going to stay there in Ukraine for as long as it takes, because to them, this war is existential in terms of being this sort of international power that can remotely compete with like the United States or even China, right?
Yeah.
So I think people in the West sort of don't understand that, because to us, Ukraine is just this like random backwater country on the other side of the planet. We're super rich, and it doesn't matter if we send all this material to Ukraine to be used up, because it doesn't really affect us at all. But to Russia, the future of their country's political power on the world stage depends on this outcome.
Yeah.
And if they lose, it's over basically for Russia.
It'll
Because
just be like an extension of Europe. Is that what you're saying?
no, they'll just be like India or some other country that is reasonably large. Has
Resources.
doesn't have the economy of like Egypt or something. But or maybe it's Romania. It doesn't have the economy of Romania, but isn't like an international actor like China's aiming to be, right? So yeah, Russia's just not going to tolerate that. And yeah, again, Ukraine being in NATO is a huge problem, because it would be sort of like I don't know, Texas joining the Soviet Union, or Mexico maybe. Like from the Russian perspective, it cannot have this, because if tanks were if NATO tanks and armies were in Ukraine, Moscow couldn't defend itself. Period. Like there's no
would NATO
possibility.
do that, or would NATO
Poland
use that?
Poland is doing it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Poland has the largest land. Poland Poland has the largest land army in Europe right now, and Poles hate Russians, and they also hate Germans. But the Germans are just totally and utterly defeated. So they're looking east right now. And
do you think Poland would get imperial?
Poland is an imperial country. I mean,
would they march into St. Petersburg if they had the chance?
This is a weird. This is my weird theory. But basically the stated aim of the United States is the total destruction of the Russian Federation. Like at the end of the Cold War, they were hoping that Russia itself would fall apart, and it didn't. The problem is, if that happens, what happens to the nuclear weapons?
Yeah.
And my weird theory is one of the reasons that NATO wants such a large Polish army is to basically go on a peacekeeping mission, quote unquote peacekeeping mission, in the former territory of Russia if the US actually succeeds in collapsing it. Obviously, Poland wants its own army for its own purposes as well.
Yeah.
Because again, Poland is not some like tiny little cuddly country, as I've said before. Poland was once a great empire in Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And, for the last several centuries, it hasn't been that. It's been, Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia. In Eastern Europe, there's not enough room for four empires, basically. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire is wrecked. Germany's wrecked. Russia's pretty much wrecked right now. And Poland is to re-emerge as a real... And there are several initiatives around doing this, right? I'm not just like theorizing here. If you look into the Three Seas initiative, and various other projects sort of designed around being successors to this idea of intermarium, which is like a Polish-oriented political alliance.
Huh.
Poland is basically being built up as like the new Germany, in a sense, the new like powerhouse, the economic powerhouse of Europe, basically.
Really?
And yes, yeah, check out the Three Seas Initiative, um, which is designed to basically link all of the countries of Eastern Europe into this economic bloc that's focused on green energy, transportation, and digital infrastructure, I think is the third one. Um, those are very interesting things, especially the rail and transportation aspect, because uh, if you need to transport armies around Europe, you do it by rail, basically.
Yeah.
And the green energy part is there, as I said, for other reasons to establish economic independence from the East, basically. And the three seas are the Adriatic, the Black Sea, and the
Okay.
Baltic.
Yeah.
So it's basically this chain of countries designed to form an economic bloc centered around Poland to completely cut Russia off from Europe. That's the project right now, is because Russia's just going to be cut off, basically, is the idea. And the Ukraine is really, really important in doing that, because control over the Ukraine on the NATO side would leave Russia totally cut off and basically screwed. No one to sell their fossil fuel products to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but anyway, Poland, yeah, Poland should be taken very seriously. Despite its tragic history and the last century, people tend to not really think about Poland as like a country that could really assert itself. But it absolutely can. And the Poles
What would
definitely
it
have a
assert
mind to do so.
itself to do? I mean, can it carve out an empire of those three seas? Can it like just become its own thing and
It
say,
can
screw you,
economically.
Europe, we're going to deal with whoever we want. We'll take some of Russia oil or whatever we want to do. And could they possibly defy the United States, or would they need the United
No, the
States?
U.S. loves this
Okay.
because Poland is almost entirely dependent on the United States for its military,
Oh,
going back for decades. Like
lucky to us.
yeah. So the Poles love the U.S. Because they love NATO, and they love not being part of the Soviet Union. So if you look at the literature in the Three Seas Initiative, it's very, very pro-U.S. and
Okay.
actually somewhat anti-German as well. Although the Germans are thrown a bit of a bone because you can't leave them out entirely. But I think it's clear if you look at what's happening economically in Eastern Europe. Poland is basically being set up as the new industrial center and military center of Europe, and it will act as a block against any possible Russian expansion. And all this happens economically, not really. Like the
Yeah.
military aspect sort of exists as a contingency because wars can happen. But the way imperialism works, especially in the quote unquote developed world, is through economic blocks, which can be just as effective in the long term.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot more going on in Ukraine than just what's happening in Ukraine. It's connected to this whole other series of developments that have been happening for years,
Yeah.
decades, since the end of the Soviet Union. Because the U.S. doesn't view this as over, right? If you look back 30 years, the U.S. State Department was actively seeking the total collapse of Russia, but miraculously, it's managed to hold itself together. Like, it's got a partnership with Belarus still, and it has a foothold in Ukraine. And this sort of thing is totally unacceptable to the United States, because I think mostly for like historical ideological, like the idea that Russia like actually needs to be destroyed is kind of ridiculous. When you look at how insanely wealthy and powerful the U.S. is,
Huh.
but it is going to pursue that to the absolute ends of the earth, as far as we can tell from what the regime is doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and probably with little to no cost, or without I mean, it could be potentially the case where America just wins economically out of pursuing that utter destruction of Russia.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to lay out any hard predictions because
Well,
it's too difficult.
what's your reaction to Congress like flying the Ukraine flag and the Ukraine
Oh,
president coming
yeah.
over and giving a speech and everybody licking his boots and stuff? Like what is being
That
performed
was
there? And
so
what's your
disgusting. I
okay? You're disgusted by it.
I thought that was a meme. When I saw that, I thought it was a meme. I thought people photoshopped it,
Yeah.
and I was like, "Wait, this really happened?" I mean, I don't know. I mean, I sort of counter-signaled American patriotism earlier, but I mean, I still love America and our flag, and I hate to see this Ukrainian flag flying in our country. It's just it's unseemly to fly the flag of other nations, especially in your center of government. I mean, what is this nonsense? And the whole situation is just totally perverse because I mean, Zelensky doesn't care about Ukraine. The U.S. doesn't care about Ukraine. The sad thing is, nobody has ever cared about Ukraine. Um, and it just, I don't like all the lies of it all. Basically,
Yeah.
it just kind of grosses me out.
Well, you would
Um,
rather it just be blatantly imperialist rather than humanitarian and imperialist. If the U.S. is going to act like empire, then you'd rather it just act like empire and not be false.
I guess it's assuming no like functional differences, the lies just make it worse. Like this being sold as some sort of like great humanitarian war against Russia's imperialism, um,
Okay.
even though that's the same modus operandi as the U.S. It's just the degree of lies in society in general disgusts me, and
Huh.
it's just sort of getting turned up to 11 with the whole situation in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, in terms of the economics, it's genius and makes total sense to pit Ukraine against Russia for the U.S. interest, but I don't support war.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm not for it. I mean,
Whatever you
the
say,
whole
Charlemagne.
the whole situation is very tragic. I mean, most people in the West don't even know that this war has been going on since 2014. Um, since like on a low level,
Yeah.
basically. I mean, I find the Ukrainian government just disgusting because they've been firing missiles into the city of Donetsk, especially for almost 10 years before the
Oh.
war started, and they do it today. If you look at how the war is being done, like the Ukrainians just sort of fire artillery into the cities where there's not even like a Russian military presence, and it's just a totally very slaughter of civilians.
Why?
There's not like good guys in the war, basically. Like Ukraine is not like team good here. It's just a very tragic situation overall. And unfortunately, I mean, this is somewhat controversial, but unfortunately, Ukraine has never really had the opportunity to be a sovereign country, and it still isn't. And I guess I just the nationalist side, the rightist side of me, just would like to see this resolved in some way that works for all the ethnic groups there,
Yeah.
because there is a real ethnic group called Ukraine or Ukrainians to some extent in the modern day. There are Poles living in Ukraine. There are Russians living there. Um, I think, like we mentioned earlier, about how it's hard to see this happening under a Trump presidency. I mean, surely there's some decision handled without going to a full scale war.
Yeah.
I mean, like the borders in Eastern Europe since the end of the Soviet Union are treated like they were written on the earth by God Himself, but Europe's never been that way, and I don't have a problem with like
Huh.
parts of this country being part of that country, etc. I mean, look, like Poland owns half of Germany. Ukraine owns parts of Poland, like the city of Lviv in the east, or
Yeah.
sorry, the west. That used to be part of Poland. Königsberg, or Kaliningrad, is now owned by the Russians. That was the capital of Prussia. Um, Basically, all of Prussia is in part of Poland's territory now. Territories just change.
Yeah.
If territories need to change in, or I shouldn't even say need to, if changing the lines on the map a little bit in the east of Ukraine avoids full scale war, uh, why not? I mean,
Yeah. Do you
you know,
think Trump would have maybe been able to affect something like that? Or at least
maybe not, but
deter?
I don't think he would have provoked Russia, because the war, as far as I can tell, one of the proximate causes for the war was the water supply being cut off to the Crimea. Crimea is dependent on fresh water coming in from Ukraine, and it was cut off, I believe, about 3 months or so before the war started. So there were sort of like proximate provocations that triggered Russia into actually invading. And I think Trump potentially could have gotten the Ukrainians to stop bombing their own cities as well. Maybe he could have done that. I didn't even know that was happening until I've researched the war. But yeah, I mean that's partly why Zelensky disgusts me so much, because I mean there were other presidents before him that were doing this as well, but yeah, it's just it's kind of a classic situation in these Eastern Slavic countries, to be honest. Sort of a long history of genocide happening in this region of the world,
Huh.
with Slavs against Slavs.
Why
It's
don't
pretty
they just
crazy.
cut it out? What is their problem with
I don't
each
know.
other?
Well, it's because of the territory changing hands through so many different empires.
Yeah. Yeah.
Polish or Russian, Austro-Hungarian. I think one of the most tragic situations is like if you look at the First and Second World Wars. There's sort of like this secondary battle happening between Polish nationalists and Ukrainian nationalists in that part of the world as the German Soviet front line moves
Huh.
across the country. The Poles and Ukrainians are also genociding each other
Wow.
while that's happening, instead of allying with each other,
Yeah.
basically. Like these Eastern European countries are sort of plagued by their historical grievances with each other
Yeah.
to where
Yeah.
they're not, which is understandable, but it always puts them in a position of being unable to actually
Yeah.
sort of stand up for themselves
Yeah. Form a block.
against.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, which is what the Three Seas Initiative is supposed to be. But once again, it's going to be under U.S.
Yeah.
domination,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
um yeah, extremely tragic part of the world. Eastern Europe is,
You're
particularly
like
Ukraine.
you guys are Catholic, so you're not from there. You would be Greek Orthodox if your family was from there. Do you have any roots in that?
No, no, not at all. Although I mean, Poland is Catholic, and there's significant elements of the Catholic Church in Ukraine as well. I think historically the Unia Church, I'm not sure what it's called these days. The the churches in the East are very interesting, and I know very little about them, but
Yeah.
there are many, many different types of Catholicism and Orthodoxy in this part of the world, which produces its own level of the conflict as well.
Huh. Weird. Do you write about this on your Substack?
I have before.
Yeah.
They're paid posts, but I
Okay.
did some like I do this series called Book Notes, where I read books and then sort of half review it, half write my thoughts about it, and
Riff
you
on it.
know,
Yeah.
half just talk about what it made me think about. But I've read a few books on Eastern Europe and the historical status of these countries, and I've read a book about Ukrainian nationalism in particular, and yeah, long story short, it's very effed up.
Yeah.
Like this part of the world has never been nationally stable. It sort of artificially is now, ironically, by the Soviet Union. Like the Ukrainian SSR is really the first modern state that the Ukrainian people, so to speak, ever had, and that was created by the Soviet Union. And that state today is, uh, it's the same country basically that broke off from Russia, um, which was created by Khrushchev because Khrushchev was Ukrainian.
Oh,
Um, well, the state wasn't created by Khrushchev exactly, but Khrushchev gave them Crimea, which is interesting. Crimea is a whole other interesting aspect to it because the Crimea was controlled by the Tatars at some point, and I don't recall the history too well, but
who are the
Crimea was
Tatars?
the Tatars, I think, were descended from Mongols. But don't quote me on that
Okay.
because I'm not I'm not too familiar in that part. And I know Turkey fought a war with Russia over Crimea at some point, but I do know that Crimea is not part of Ukraine, which is
Okay.
interesting. It wasn't ever like a Cossack territory, which is sort of where the Ukrainian identity comes from. So that's like a whole other interesting part of this story as well, is the Crimea, um, which like wasn't part of Ukraine ever until Nikita Khrushchev annexed it to Ukraine, and now it's just like part of Ukraine as if it always was forever.
Weird.
Yeah, it's like it's a crazy part of the world.
Yeah, it's like what the British Empire and then the American Empire did in the Middle East, kind of just cutting up and just playing patchwork with these without
And now they
anything
fight over
understanding.
it, right?
Yeah,
Now Iraq will go to war with Iran, a couple decades ago over these borders that are just like entirely made up and literally designed to cause conflict.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's master strategy if on behalf of the Americans and the British, but we the citizens of the West think that we're doing good, and we did nothing wrong. That was history or whatever. I mean, we do perform grievance quite a bit nowadays with our past mistakes, but
Yeah, I just wish Americans would sort of try and come to understand the situation in the world more, especially during events like this. Like most Americans just don't know the first thing about the Ukraine.
it's
One of
much
the, I
easier
mean,
to
one,
just put the flag in your bio. You
yeah,
don't have to worry about
exactly.
anything. Just feel good.
Yeah, and I mean, like, one funny thing about some aspects of Ukrainian nationalism is like the Ukrainians will basically claim to be the real Russians, and they'll call, if you ever hear the term like Moscovite or Muscovite, that's sort of like to differentiate the modern state of Russia from the idea of Russia. And I don't say that like
Huh.
negatively, like the Ukrainians also are the original Russians.
In the
But then,
Prussian sense? Is that what you're saying?
no, in like the ethnic sense, like all
Okay.
these, the Duchy of Moscow sort of came to rule over the Rus, and the Rus sort of originated in Kiev, which is now, it was basically a city state, and it's now in Ukraine. But sort of all these people have like a shared ethnic history, very similar way to like the people of the United States do. Um, and the Slavs are very, for sort of obvious reasons, they have very strong um, identities, and the Ukrainians, some of them like they're like we're the real Russians, and then the Russians are like no, actually we're the real Russians. And really, they're all the real Russians in
Yeah.
a historic sense, and it's kind of like a false, well, not entirely false, but it's kind of like an exaggerated conflict that need not occur because it's like basically two brothers arguing
Yeah.
over like who's the real descendant, but it's like, well, you both are.
Yeah.
You're different, but you're also related to each other, which is actually how a lot of the worst wars seem to happen, right? It's always the people closest to you, you're the ones
Yeah.
it's easiest to argue with, and
Cain
yeah,
and
that's what we
Abel.
see.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, one wonders if Russia didn't need to be an empire, if that's what its problem is. But I can understand that it would want to defend itself against the United States' interest, right? So it's hard. It's hard for there to be peace when America is so powerful, and so these conflicts are
kind of stirred up because, like the threat of a unipolar world or a globalist hegemony kind of might be somewhat feeding into Russia's need to protect itself and to be a world power. But if we didn't have the need for a world power,
There's definitely an aspect.
yeah, which I don't think is possible. I think there's
There's definitely an aspect of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because countries are going to compete. I mean, Russia definitely doesn't need to be an empire, but that's what it is, and it's going to continue to try to be that. And the U.S. needs to take that seriously. I mean, I think tragically, like, Russia could have been brought into NATO, and it should have been. I believe it was Putin who sought that, if I recall. But it might have
Really?
been his predecessor.
Huh.
Yeah. But that wasn't brought on board, basically, which is rather unfortunate.
Because the State Department had a grudge?
Yeah, I mean, one can understand how these cold warriors were not about to bring Russia into NATO.
Okay,
But
yeah.
there were opportunities for that to happen, and I think that would have been for the best to bring Russia into the European community, because now it's drifting east. Now it's trying to form a world island bloc with China and other countries
Yeah.
on the continent, and that's unfortunate
Well,
because
it might be good insofar as competition is good, as long as it doesn't go like all war against the United States. Does the West really need to control the whole world?
no, it definitely doesn't. It seems like it does, but it is a conceit to talk about the global American empire, which it does exist, but it also doesn't. I mean, it's not like the U.S. controls China or something. I mean, also also an unfortunate side effect of capitalism is like the very existence of China as a competitor, because China's economy couldn't exist without the U.S. gobbling up its mass-produced goods, especially in the 90s. Like we created modern China as like a regional competitor. And that didn't need to happen. But this is what happens when you have like untrammeled markets and you're just like, oh, it's cheaper to just buy everything from China instead of just producing it out of our own country. There was no reason to do that.
Well, the short term, plenty of reason.
Mhm.
A lot of
Well, yeah,
economic gain.
yeah, yeah. I'm saying no reason in terms of like how I would view how to run a country in its own interests.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when capital is sort of the primary interest driving everything, then yeah, you're just going to go to the Chinese market, and oops, potential con. That's a big oopsie there.
Well, we need enemies. How else are we gonna take pride in being Americans? Can't just be a peaceful nation. There's no more frontier. Here we gotta export democracy, capitalism, freedom.
Yeah, unfortunately, the frontier of outer space isn't quite opened up yet, and it is a tragic aspect of the human condition where it does seem like we need enemies.
Yeah.
You certainly can't eliminate enmity. You can't eliminate war. These things are going to happen. I think this is one of the problems with the um, current capital D democracy, the liberal democracy worldview. Like if we spread it everywhere, we'll just eliminate war. We're never going to eliminate war. The only way to eliminate war is to eliminate human beings, which is maybe on the cards as well.
Yeah. Why not?
but war. That's why the Ukrainian war has freaked people out so much, because the idea that like war can happen in Europe is like not on
Barbaric.
the table anymore. And yeah, war is barbaric, but it will happen. And I think wars would be better avoided if countries were restrained enough to stay within their own spheres. Like the U.S. would be much better off if it stuck to the Monroe Doctrine and stopped trying to dominate every part of the European continent and any other part of the world it could get its hands on.
Yeah.
That's what's going on here. Is from Russia's perspective, the U.S. is deep within its quote unquote sphere of influence, and that is going to provoke reactions.
Yeah.
And if you take a realist view of the world, a political realist view, you can see where these lines in the sand are and avoid crossing them and avoid unnecessary conflict, which the United States is not good at because it's never had to do that. Right? The U.S. can just do whatever it wants, basically. At least that's what it thought, and that turned out to be wrong.
In what respect?
Well, the idea in the heads of people in the State Department after the end of the Cold War is that, like, we won everything. Our way is just the way for the future.
Yeah.
Communism is destroyed. Liberal democracy forever. It turned out that wasn't the case. The U.S. didn't really win the Cold War so much as the Soviet Union kind of trashed itself, basically because Gorbachev just took the whole thing apart. So it wasn't this grand ideological victory for liberal democracy that demonstrated the eternal power and presence of the capitalist American way of life, but that is what many people in power took it to mean. And because of that, they seem to believe that we could simply enact the will of that ideology like anywhere we wanted without consequence, because there were no more competitors. You've heard of this idea, the end of history, which is a little misquoted, but you get the concept. But it wasn't the end of history. History is still going on, and it's not the case that the United States can just go around doing whatever it wants anywhere, because other countries have their own interests, and that's why that's why the concept, the rightist concept of the nation is important, because you have to recognize that everywhere is not the same, and people have different interests, and they're going to compete, and that's fine, and maybe they can compete going to war with each other. And it's my contention that we can have a more peaceful world if we allow national interests to exist and pursue their interests within their own reasonable limits and not attempt to dominate them. Because it seems that empires simply expand indefinitely until they either collapse. Well, they always collapse, right? Empire in general is bad. Russian Empire, bad. American Empire, bad. Empire is basically never good for your actual citizens at home, unfortunately. It brings a lot of strife, but it brings a lot of power to the elite, which is why empires are pursued.
Yeah, or just naturally form.
Yeah.
Well, Charlemagne, where can people read and watch your stuff? And I'll link your Substack and your Twitter, if you want your Twitter, in the description, and your channel for sure, your YouTube channel. But what are you working on going forward?
The best place to find me is charlemagne.substack.com, which is my blog, and then my YouTube channel, which is just called Charlemagne. And you could search like Mulling Over Moldbug is my main series. If you put that in the search bar, you'll find it. I would say go to the Old Glory Club, though. The Old Glory Club is a group of American patriots, I guess you could say, who very much think in some similar ways as I do, but we also have a lot of diversity in our thinking as well.
Degenerates?
No degenerates, I would say. Well, we do have one manosphere type guy, so it's arguable, but it's all right. But yeah, the Old Glory Club is this interesting new fraternity. It's like a fraternal organization. We do some political commentary on our blog. It's just Old Glory Club, and we also have an Old Glory Club YouTube channel, and we're trying to focus not only on politics, but also on culture. And ultimately what we want to do with this is to create a mutual aid society to help one another out when we run into financial straits. And that is a project that we hope to evolve the Old Glory Club into. But for now, you can find it on Substack, oldgloryclub.substack.com, and Old Glory Club on YouTube. And
When did that start? When did you guys kick that off?
started officially like 2 or 3 months ago, I think. So it's fairly new.
Cool.
But most of us who created this new little institution, which people like the Distributist are a member of, we actually met in person earlier in 2022, and at a conference basically designed to produce this exact outcome.
Okay.
So we're sort of stepping over the digital world and trying to form something real, at least between people who know each other in some real capacity at this point.
Was that the same meetup where Dave did that cool talk about that yogurt commercial?
Yep, that was a great talk.
Yeah, it was good. He knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, so yeah, I spoke at that event as well, in my own humble way.
Is
I
your
think his
video
talk was
up?
better. No, it's not.
Okay.
They're private, but some of them have been released, basically to encourage people to actually go to the events, and meet each other. But yeah, so the Old Glory Club was formed out of that, and I'm honestly hoping that'll be sort of like my main place of
Really?
content production right now. Yeah,
As long
I
as
think
the
it's more
anti-fascists don't find you, root you out, right?
yeah, well, there's always that risk, but I don't think we're particularly controversial. We're just American patriots.
Yeah.
And we love America.
Isn't that controversial in this day and age?
Yeah, it kind of is.
Controversial enough. That sounds great. I will personally check it out, and I'll definitely link that. Thanks a lot for joining me, just accepting a random invite from some internet stranger. It's great to pick your brain and learn more about the topics that you're invested in.
Cool. Yeah, no, it was a good talk, and thanks for inviting me. I like reaching out to different spaces and getting out of the same loops I'm always in.
Yeah, yeah. Spreading your word, your seed. Yeah.
Well, maybe not that.
No? Okay. I mean, someday, maybe.
Yeah. Someday with a special lady, but not on the podcast.
Maybe you never know. Maybe that's where you'll meet her.
I'm aiming for Twitter.
You
Twitter,
got some Twitter girls?
Yeah, Twitter is a dating site. Most people don't know this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a pretty good one for making community. I think I don't know. I know that it's simulacra and simulation, these relationships we form via the internet, but I think that they're actually more real than not. I think that they actually do have value and substance to them, even though they are virtual.
They certainly do, and I know of at least one couple who met on Twitter. And I mean, hell, I have friends who met playing Guild Wars way back in the day, and they're married now.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
Do you game at all on your mountaintop?
Not in a long time.
No.
I love video games. It's hard to find time for them, but once I get my desktop out of storage, maybe I'll do a little bit of gaming.
Huh. That's great. It's always great to hear that somebody doesn't have enough time for video games.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's also good.
Yeah.
I'm getting stuff done.
Yeah. That's how I ingest most of my podcasts. I just put on a RPG and absorb these different content creators.
Yeah. I've done that before as well.
I'm going to end the recording.